Hello there and welcome to Just About Earth, a quiet place where curiosity slows down, where big questions are allowed to stretch out comfortably, and where science takes the long way around so your mind doesn't have to rush anywhere tonight. Wherever you're listening from, whether the lights are low or the room is already dark, I hope you can let your thoughts settle just a little as we begin. Tonight, we're going to explore an idea that doesn't shout for attention, but waits patiently beneath the surface of deep time. It is the thought that before our familiar history began, before the first cities we name in textbooks, before writing, before memory itself had anything to hold on to, there may have been another beginning. Not a mythological one filled with gods and thunder, but a quiet, earthly one shaped by stone, water, heat, and time. The idea is simple to state, but vast in its implications. What if the first civilization did not rise and fall within the world we recognise, but instead lived on a planet that was still whole? When all the continents were joined together as one enormous landmass, long before the Earth slowly began to tear itself apart. Before we wander too far into that possibility, take a moment to notice where you are right now. Maybe you are listening late at night, or very early in the morning, or somewhere in between where time feels a little blurry. What part of the world are you in as you hear these words, and what does the earth beneath you look like there? Solid ground feels permanent, dependable, unmoving. It is easy to forget that the place you are sitting or lying down was not always where it is now, and will not always remain there. If this gentle exploration feels calming or sparks a quiet sense of wonder, you're always welcome to like the video or subscribe. It helps this small corner of thoughtful calm reach others who might enjoy drifting through ideas like this as well. For now, there is nothing you need to do except listen and let the story unfold at its own pace. Imagine the Earth not as a globe of scattered continents separated by wide oceans, but as a single sprawling world of land. No Atlantic Ocean, no Pacific, no Indian Ocean carving distance between shores. Instead, there is one immense supercontinent, stretching from pole to pole, ringed by a vast global sea. This was Pangaea, not a fantasy or a guess, but a well-supported chapter in Earth's history. Long before humans, before mammals, before dinosaurs even had their long reign, the continents were locked together like pieces of a puzzle that had not yet been pulled apart. Rivers ran for thousands of kilometres without ever meeting an ocean. Mountain ranges rose where continental plates pressed into one another, not knowing yet that one day they would be separated by entire hemispheres. When we picture ancient civilizations, our minds tend to jump to familiar images. Stone temples, city walls, pottery shards, written symbols pressed into clay or carved into rock. We imagine them nestled beside rivers or coastlines that still exist today, their ruins waiting patiently to be uncovered. But that picture depends entirely on one assumption, that civilization must leave behind traces that survive the relentless churn of geological time. It also assumes that the Earth itself has remained mostly unchanged during the span in which intelligent life could arise. Both assumptions feel reasonable when we think in thousands of years, or even tens of thousands. They become much less certain when we stretch our thinking across hundreds of millions. Pangaea existed roughly between 300 million and 200 million years ago, give or take. That is a span of time so long that it swallows the entire history of our species many times over. Modern humans have existed for perhaps 300,000 years. Even our earliest hominin ancestors go back only a few million. The dinosaurs ruled the Earth for about 160 million years. Pangaea itself formed, lived, and began to break apart across a timeline that dwarfs all of these familiar markers. During that time, climates shifted dramatically. Ice ages came and went. Seas rose and fell. Entire lineages of life appeared, flourished, and vanished without leaving more than faint chemical signatures behind. It is within this immense stretch of deep time that a quiet question begins to take shape. Could complex intelligence have arisen earlier than we think, lived for a time, and then been erased so thoroughly by the Earth's own processes that almost nothing recognizable remains, not erased by catastrophe alone, but by erosion, subduction, metamorphosis, and the slow recycling of crust back into the mantle. The Earth is not a museum that carefully preserves everything that happens on its surface. It is more like a restless workshop, constantly melting down its own creations to make something new. When continents collide, mountains rise. When continents pull apart, oceans are born. But when one tectonic plate slides beneath another, entire landscapes are dragged downward, crushed, heated, and transformed beyond recognition. Any cities, roads, or structures built on those surfaces would not simply crumble into ruins. They would be ground into minerals, folded into rock layers, and eventually melted. Even the oceans are not safe archives. The seafloor is constantly renewed, with new crust forming at mid-ocean ridges and old crust sinking back into the earth. The oldest ocean floor we know of today is less than 200 million years old. Anything older has already been recycled. So if an early civilization had existed during the age of Pangea, its physical traces would face a nearly impossible challenge. They would need to survive hundreds of millions of years of tectonic movement, weathering chemical alteration and biological activity. Wood would rot, metals would corrode and disperse, stone would fracture, dissolve, or be transformed under pressure and heat. Even if something endured for a time, it might end up buried kilometers deep or pulverized into sediment indistinguishable from its surroundings. This is not to say such a civilization did exist, but rather to acknowledge that the absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence, especially on a planet that actively destroys its own past. We tend to think of history as something layered neatly beneath our feet, older things below, newer things above. In reality, the Earth folds, flips, shatters, and rearranges those layers endlessly. A structure built in one place could be scattered across continents, or erased entirely, leaving behind nothing we would recognize as intentional. The idea of a first civilization often triggers images of advanced technology, glowing machines, or knowledge far beyond our own. That expectation may itself be a limitation. Civilization does not require metal skyscrapers or digital networks. At its core, it involves sustained social organization, shared knowledge, tools, and an ability to shape the environment intentionally over time. A civilization adapted to a Pangian world might look nothing like ours. It might rely on materials that do not fossilize well. It might build with organic substances, earthworks, or structures designed to blend back into the landscape. It might leave behind chemical or isotopic signatures rather than recognizable artifacts. Life itself had already proven remarkably inventive long before humans arrived. By the time Pangaea formed, complex multicellular organisms were well established. Forests existed. Large animals walked the land. Ecosystems were intricate and resilient. Intelligence, at least in limited forms, had already appeared in various lineages. Cephalopods today demonstrate problem-solving abilities and memory. Birds and mammals show social complexity and tool use. Intelligence is not a singular event, but a trait that can emerge under many conditions. If an intelligent species had evolved during Pangaea, it would have faced a world very different from ours. With one continuous landmass, migration patterns would be vast. Climate zones would be extreme, with deep continental interiors experiencing intense heat or cold far from moderating ocean influences. Deserts could stretch for thousands of kilometers. Monsoon systems might behave differently. Coastal regions would still exist, but the geometry of currents and winds would shape life in unfamiliar ways. Such a civilization, if it arose, would not know continents drifting apart. From its perspective, the land would feel eternal. Mountains might slowly grow or erode, but the idea that the ground itself could someday split and carry entire cultures away from one another would be beyond imagination. The separation of Pangaea happened slowly, over tens of millions of years. No single generation would notice it, Coastlines would creep, rifts would widen, shallow seas would form where dry land once lay. Over time, what was once a connected world would become fragmented, isolating populations, altering climates, and reshaping ecosystems. If that civilization depended on long-distance travel or shared knowledge across the land, those connections would gradually strain. Journeys that once took weeks might take months or become impossible. Familiar routes could flood or fracture. The world would not end suddenly. It would change quietly, persistently, without ceremony. Adaptation would be required, and not all societies adapt at the same pace or in the same way. What is striking is how closely this mirrors patterns we see much later in human history, on a smaller scale. Civilizations have risen in stable climates and declined when conditions shifted. Trade networks have collapsed when geography changed or resources moved. Knowledge has been lost when connections broke. The difference here is scale. On a Pangian Earth, those forces would operate not across regions, but across the entire planet. As the land split and oceans widened, populations could become isolated for millions of years. Languages, technologies, and cultures would diverge until they were unrecognizable to one another. Assuming any survived at all, some groups might retreat inland, others toward coasts. Some might adapt, others might fade. Over geological timescales, even survival does not guarantee remembrance. The fossil record already tells us that life has been reset many times. Mass extinctions have wiped out the majority of species on Earth in relatively short periods. The causes vary: volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, climate collapse, ocean anoxia. In the aftermath, life recovers, but it does not restore what was lost. It invents again. If an early civilization had existed, it would not need to be destroyed by a single dramatic event. It could simply be overtaken by environmental change, fragmented by continental drift, and eventually erased by the same processes that erase mountains. This brings us to a quiet but important realization. The Earth does not remember in the way we do. It records pressure, temperature, chemistry, and structure, but not intention. It does not label a stone as a tool or a wall as a home. Over enough time, all of it becomes rock again, folded back into the slow language of geology. What we call history survives only because it is recent. Deep time is not kind to memory. As we continue exploring this idea, it is worth keeping that scale in mind. Not to inflate the mystery, but to ground it. The question is not whether such a civilization could hide from us intentionally. It is whether the Earth itself would allow us to find it at all. The surface you know is temporary. The oceans you cross are temporary. Even the continents beneath your feet are passing through a phase. From here, we can begin to look more closely at what Pangaea itself was like. Not as a diagram in a textbook, but as a living world with climates, ecosystems, and rhythms very different from our own. Understanding that landscape helps us understand what kinds of life could exist there, and what kinds of traces might vanish without a trace. The story does not end here, and it does not resolve into certainty. It simply moves forward, carried by the slow motion of the planet itself, as we follow it into the shape of a world that no longer exists, but once did. Long before anyone could draw a line on a map, before borders were argued over or named, before even the idea of a continent existed as a separate thing, the Earth offered no clear divisions at all. Land did not come in pieces. It arrived as one vast, uninterrupted expanse, stretching farther than any traveller could reasonably imagine crossing in a single lifetime. There were no edges in the familiar sense, no moments where the ground clearly stopped being one place and became another defined somewhere else. The world was continuous, and for anything living on it, that continuity would have shaped every decision, every movement, every way of thinking. To picture this properly, it helps to set aside modern instincts. Today, we're surrounded by boundaries that feel natural even when we know they are artificial. Countries have borders, regions have names, Continents are separated by oceans so wide that crossing them feels like a major event, even with modern technology. We grow up absorbing these divisions so thoroughly that it is difficult to imagine a world without them. Yet for most of Earth's history, those divisions simply did not exist. There was no sense of Africa drifting away from South America, no idea of Eurasia or Australia or Antarctica as distinct destinations. There was only land stretching on, shaped by climate and terrain rather than by invisible lines. In such a world, movement would not be framed as migration between continents. It would simply be travel. Rivers would guide journeys instead of borders. Mountain ranges would be obstacles or landmarks, not political boundaries. Deserts would be regions to cross carefully, not edges of nations. The concept of being from somewhere else would be less about crossing a line and more about how far one had travelled, how the air smelled different, how the plants changed, how the animals behaved. Identity would be tied to ecosystems rather than territories. A continuous landmass changes how life spreads. When barriers are few, genes flow freely. Species expand their ranges gradually, following favourable conditions. Isolation, when it occurs, comes from climate, altitude, or distance rather than from oceans. This has consequences not only for biology, but for culture and knowledge as well. Ideas, tools, and practices would diffuse slowly but steadily across the land, carried by travellers, traders, or wanderers whose journeys might span generations rather than months. If an early civilization arose in such a setting, its sense of the world would be fundamentally different from ours. There would be no reason to imagine the planet as broken into large pieces separated by impossible distances. The Earth would feel whole, even if it was vast beyond comprehension. Stories would not begin with "across the sea" as something exotic and unreachable. Instead, the unknown would lie beyond the next mountain chain, across the next stretch of unfamiliar forest or arid plain. Without maps as we know them, knowledge of place would be embodied rather than abstract. Directions would be learned through experience, passed on through memory and narrative rather than symbols on paper. Landmarks would matter deeply. A particular bend in a river, a distinctive rock formation, a grove of unusual trees, these would anchor understanding. Over time, such knowledge could become extraordinarily detailed, even if it was never written down. Oral traditions, practical routes, seasonal movements, all of these could form a mental geography just as rich as any modern atlas. Borders do more than divide land. They divide responsibility, identity, and often memory. In their absence, the idea of ownership might look very different. Land could be shared, traversed, revisited over cycles of seasons rather than claimed permanently. This does not mean conflict would be absent. Resources would still be contested. Favourable regions would still attract competition, but the conflicts would be shaped by proximity and need, not by abstract claims over distant territory. Continents today act as evolutionary and cultural incubators precisely because they are isolated. Australia's wildlife evolved along a path unlike anywhere else, because oceans cut it off. The Americas developed independently for millions of years. Africa's long continuity shaped the path of human evolution. In a Pangian world, those isolations would not exist, or would exist only in limited shifting forms. This could slow divergence in some ways while accelerating complexity in others. Cultures might borrow freely, adapting ideas rather than reinventing them in isolation. At the same time, the sheer size of the landmass would introduce its own forms of separation. A journey from one side of Pangaea to the other could take generations. Climate zones would vary dramatically. The interior of the supercontinent would be far from the moderating influence of oceans, leading to extreme seasonal swings. Summers could be brutally hot, winters could be bitterly cold. Entire regions might be inhospitable for long stretches of the year. These conditions could create cultural islands not defined by water, but by heat, cold, or scarcity. This kind of separation is subtle. It does not announce itself with a coastline. It creeps in through habit and necessity. People settle where survival is easier. They avoid regions that demand too much. Over time, those choices create gaps in contact. Knowledge may stop flowing smoothly. Practices diverge. Dialects shift. What began as a single, continuous cultural fabric could slowly fray into loosely connected threads. Now imagine this process unfolding over millions of years, not thousands. Long before Pangaea began to split, it was already dynamic. Plates pressed together, lifting mountains. Others sagged, creating basins. Sea levels rose and fell, flooding shallow areas and retreating again. The land was never static. It breathed on geological timescales, expanding and contracting, reshaping itself without regard for anything living upon it. In this context, the idea of a first civilization becomes less about monumental ruins and more about persistence. Could an intelligent species maintain continuity of knowledge across such immense spans of time and space? Could it adapt to shifting climates and landscapes without the anchors we rely on, like written records or stable coastlines? If it did, its achievements might not look like ours at all. They might be embedded in practices, in relationships with the environment, in ways of living that leave little behind once abandoned. We often equate civilization with permanence, stone buildings, cities that endure for centuries. But permanence is a fragile illusion on a restless planet. Even our most enduring structures are temporary on geological timescales. Given enough time, everything erodes. Mountains flatten, seas swallow coastlines. The idea that civilization must announce itself loudly to be real is a bias shaped by our short perspective. A world without continents would also shape how time itself was experienced. Seasonal cycles would still exist, driven by the tilt of the Earth's axis. But regional patterns could be broader, less fragmented. Monsoon systems might stretch across enormous distances. Droughts could persist for thousands of kilometers. Abundance and scarcity would move like slow waves across the land. Planning for the future would require attention not just to local signs, but to distant changes carried by travelers and shifting ecosystems. In such a setting, long-distance awareness would matter. Even without maps, information could travel. Stories of changing conditions far away might influence decisions locally. A drying region hundreds of kilometers distant could eventually affect migration, trade, or conflict. The sense of the world would be expansive, even if it was not precisely measured. As Pangaea began its slow fragmentation, these patterns would shift again. Rifts would open. Shallow seas would intrude. What was once a long overland journey might become a coastal route, then an island chain, then an open ocean. Each stage would introduce new forms of separation. Communities that once exchanged goods and ideas directly might find themselves cut off, forced to adapt independently. The crucial point is that none of this would happen quickly enough to be dramatic in a single lifetime. There would be no announcement, no moment where the world clearly broke apart. Instead, there would be a gradual accumulation of small changes. A river becomes wider. A lowland floods more often. A familiar route becomes unreliable. Over generations, those inconveniences become barriers. Over longer spans, they become oceans. If an early civilization existed during this transition, it would not perceive itself as living through the splitting of a supercontinent. It would experience a world that slowly became harder to navigate as it once had. Knowledge networks might thin. Shared traditions might diverge. Some groups might thrive in new coastal environments, learning to navigate emerging seas. Others might retreat inland, losing contact with former neighbours. What we are left with, millions of years later, is a planet that bears no obvious scars labelled here something intelligent once lived. The scars we do see are geological, rift valleys, passive margins, ocean basins. These tell us about forces far larger than any civilization. They do not preserve the details of daily life, of thought, of social structure. This is why imagining a time before maps, borders, or continents matters. It reminds us that our way of dividing the world is recent, fragile, and deeply contingent on geography that itself is temporary. It opens the possibility that intelligent life could have organized itself around a very different sense of place, one that left few durable markers once the land itself changed shape. When Pangaea is mentioned, it is often treated like a frozen diagram, a puzzle image shown in textbooks where the continents are neatly snapped together and labelled before being pulled apart again. That version is useful, but it is incomplete. Pangaea was not a static slab of land waiting patiently for tectonic plates to do something interesting. It was a living landscape in constant motion, shaped by forces that operated slowly but relentlessly, and experienced by every organism on it as weather, terrain, and survival. To understand what life could be like on such a world, it helps to imagine the planet not from space, but from ground level. Imagine standing somewhere deep in the interior of this immense landmass. The nearest coastline might be thousands of kilometres away. There is no salty breeze drifting inland, no moderating influence from large bodies of water. The sky above you behaves differently here. Clouds form less readily. Rain is less predictable. Seasons arrive with greater intensity. Summer heat lingers, building day after day, while winters bring cold that settles deeply into the soil and stone. This continental interior would have been a place of extremes. Modern continents already show this pattern on a smaller scale. Central Asia, for example, experiences some of the hottest summers and coldest winters on Earth because it lies far from oceanic influence. Now expand that effect across an entire supercontinent. Vast regions of Pangaea would have been dominated by arid or semi-arid climates, not because the planet was dry overall, but because moisture simply could not travel far enough inland to balance evaporation. Deserts on Pangaea were not small patches between greener regions. They could stretch for immense distances, shaped by global wind patterns that circle the supercontinent. These were not static deserts either. Over long periods they expanded, contracted and shifted position as climate cycles changed. Life adapted accordingly. Plants evolved to conserve water. Animals developed strategies to cope with heat and scarcity. Rivers became lifelines, carving narrow corridors of abundance through otherwise unforgiving terrain. Closer to the edges of Pangaea, the world looked very different. Coastlines wrapped around the supercontinent like a single, nearly continuous ribbon. Shallow seas flooded low-lying areas, creating broad coastal plains, wetlands and deltas. These regions were rich in nutrients, fed by sediments washed down from the interior. Life flourished here. Forests could thrive where rainfall was more regular. Marine ecosystems blended into terrestrial ones, creating zones of exceptional productivity. Importantly, these coastlines were not fixed. Sea levels rose and fell over geological time as ice formed and melted at the poles, and as tectonic forces reshaped the crust. A coastal settlement, if one existed, might find itself inland after thousands of years, or submerged beneath shallow seas. Over much longer timescales, entire coastal regions could be lost to subduction or buried beneath layers of sediment. Mountains were another defining feature of Pangaea as a living landscape. The formation of the supercontinent involved massive continental collisions, events that crumpled the crust and thrust up mountain ranges comparable to or larger than today's Himalayas. These mountains were not just scenery, they shaped climate by redirecting winds and creating rain shadows. One side of a range could be lush and wet, while the other remained dry and harsh. Over millions of years these mountains eroded. Rivers carried their material away grain by grain, feeding distant plains and seas. What began as towering peaks slowly softened into rolling highlands, then flattened into broad plateaus. Yet even as old mountains wore down, new ones rose elsewhere. Pangaea was a place of constant geological renewal, even if no single generation could perceive it. This dynamic terrain meant that habitats were always changing. Forests expanded and retreated. Grasslands emerged where forests once stood. Wetlands dried up. New river systems formed as old ones were diverted by tectonic shifts or sediment buildup. Life responded not by remaining fixed, but by moving, adapting, or disappearing. If an intelligent civilization existed in such a setting, it would be shaped as much by these slow changes as by any internal developments. Long-term planning would be constrained by uncertainty. A river that sustained generations might gradually change course. A fertile plain could become less reliable as rainfall patterns shifted. Knowledge of the land would need to be flexible, updated continuously through experience rather than assumed to be permanent. This stands in contrast to how we often think of ancient civilizations, anchored to stable features like the Nile or the Tigris and Euphrates. Even those rivers have shifted over time, but within limits small enough for written history to track. On Pangaea, many environmental changes would unfold over spans far longer than any written record, assuming writing existed at all. Another important aspect of Pangaea as a living landscape is its biological connectivity. With land bridges everywhere and no major ocean barriers, species could spread widely. This does not mean the planet was biologically uniform. Climate gradients still created distinct ecosystems, but it does mean that the potential for exchange was much greater than on today's fragmented continents. For an early civilization, this could have profound implications. Technologies, agricultural practices, or social structures might spread gradually across vast distances, adapted locally but sharing a common ancestry. At the same time, the sheer scale of the landmass would slow communication. News might take generations to travel from one region to another, carried by chains of contact rather than direct exchange. This creates a world where continuity and fragmentation coexist. Everything is connected in principle, but not necessarily in practice. The land allows movement, but distance imposes limits. Climate allows growth, but variability introduces risk. Civilization, if it arose, would be both unified and diverse, coherent in some respects and wildly varied in others. It is also important to consider the role of fire in this landscape. Large, dry interiors combined with periodic lightning storms would make wildfires common. Fire shapes ecosystems profoundly. It clears old growth, releases nutrients, and creates opportunities for new species. Intelligent life would have to understand and manage fire not just as a tool, but as a recurring force of nature. Volcanism added another layer of dynamism. The assembly and breakup of Pangaea were associated with extensive volcanic activity. Large igneous provinces released vast amounts of lava and gases over relatively short geological periods. These events could alter climate globally, causing warming, cooling, or acidification of oceans. Life endured these episodes, but not without disruption. From the perspective of a civilization living through such times, these changes might appear as periods of hardship without clear cause. Crops fail, weather patterns shift, ecosystems reorganize. Without an understanding of plate tectonics or atmospheric chemistry, explanations would likely be local, symbolic, or practical rather than global. Adaptation would come through trial, error, and memory passed down across generations. One of the most overlooked aspects of Pangaea as a living landscape is time itself. Not clock time, but environmental time. Seasons would still cycle annually, but longer rhythms would be more subtle. Multi-century droughts, gradual cooling or warming trends, slow encroachment of deserts or forests. These patterns require long-term awareness to recognize, and even longer-term strategies to respond to. Human societies today struggle with changes that unfold over decades. On Pangaea, the most significant transformations would unfold over thousands or millions of years. far beyond the intuitive grasp of any single individual. A civilization's resilience would depend on whether its knowledge systems could encode and transmit lessons learned across many generations, even as the environment slowly rewrote the context in which those lessons applied. As Pangaea approached the period when it would begin to split, these dynamics intensified. Stresses built up in the crust. Rift zones formed. Volcanic activity increased in some regions. The landscape itself signalled change, but in a language measured in deep time rather than sudden catastrophe. Valleys widened, ground subsided. Shallow seas crept inland along new fractures. Life adapted again. Coastal ecosystems expanded into newly flooded areas. Inland routes were altered. What had once been a continuous land corridor might become marshy, then impassable, then submerged. For any society relying on established pathways, this would be a slow but profound disruption. Seen this way, Pangaea was not simply the backdrop for life. It was an active participant. It shaped evolution, constrained movement, redistributed resources, and ultimately dismantled the very continuity it had once provided. Any civilization emerging within it would be inseparable from these processes, rising not despite them, but through constant negotiation with them. This perspective helps explain why we should be cautious about expecting obvious remnants of such a civilization. The living landscape of Pangaea did not preserve things gently. It recycled them. It ground them down, buried them, transformed them. What survives from that era does so largely by accident, locked into conditions that protected it from heat, pressure, and time. When people ask whether intelligence could have arisen earlier than we think, the question often hides another assumption beneath it. The assumption is that intelligence looks a certain way, behaves a certain way, and leaves behind a certain kind of evidence. Usually that evidence is imagined as tools, structures, symbols, or machines that resemble our own. But intelligence itself is not a single invention, nor is it tied to one particular biological form. It is a strategy, one of many that life experiments with when conditions allow it. On Earth, intelligence has emerged multiple times in different branches of life. It did not wait patiently for humans to arrive. Long before our species appeared, evolution was already testing ways to sense, remember, predict, and respond to the environment with increasing flexibility. Brains did not arrive fully formed. They grew slowly, incrementally, shaped by survival pressures that rewarded anticipation and learning. Even today, intelligence does not belong exclusively to animals with large brains or familiar faces. Octopuses solve puzzles, recognize individuals, and plan escapes, despite being separated from us by hundreds of millions of years of evolution. Birds demonstrate memory, problem-solving, and even basic tool construction. Mammals exhibit social intelligence, emotional awareness, and long-term planning. None of these lineages inherited intelligence from a single ancestor. They arrived at it independently, shaped by their own ecological challenges. This matters because it suggests that intelligence is not a rare fluke, but a recurring outcome when certain conditions align. Those conditions include environmental complexity, long lifespans, flexible bodies, or manipulators, and selective pressure favouring learning over rigid instinct. Pangaea, as a living and changing world, provided many such conditions across vast stretches of time. The fossil record shows that complex nervous systems existed far earlier than most people realise. By the time Pangaea formed, animals with centralised brains had already evolved. Predators and prey were locked into evolutionary arms races that rewarded speed, perception, and decision-making. Social behaviours were emerging. Some species coordinated movements, others cared for offspring. These are not trivial steps. They are the foundations upon which more elaborate cognition can build. It is tempting to imagine intelligence as a sudden leap, a moment where something switches on. In reality, it is more like a slope than a step. Each small advantage compounds over time. Slightly better memory leads to better foraging. Better foraging supports longer development. Longer development allows more learning. More learning encourages social interaction. Social interaction drives communication. Communication reshapes cognition. None of this requires a specific destination in mind. If intelligence could arise gradually, the next question becomes whether it could reach a level of complexity comparable to early human societies long before humans existed. The answer depends less on raw brain size and more on stability. Intelligence thrives when organisms have time to learn, share knowledge, and build on previous experience. That requires environments that are challenging but not constantly catastrophic. Pangaea, despite its extremes, offered long periods of relative stability in many regions. While climate shifted over geological timescales, local environments could remain consistent for millions of years. River systems persisted. Forests expanded and contracted gradually. Coastal zones migrated slowly. For life forms adapted to these conditions, there would be time not just to survive, but to refine behaviours across many generations. One obstacle often raised against early intelligence is energy. Brains are expensive organs. They consume a great deal of energy relative to their size. Supporting them requires reliable access to calories. Yet Pangaea supported enormous biomass. Vast forests, extensive coastal wetlands, and productive shallow seas all existed at various times. Herbivores grew large. Predators followed. Energy flowed through ecosystems on a scale that could support metabolically demanding adaptations. Another objection is the lack of evidence for technology. But technology itself is not binary. It does not begin with metal tools and cities. It begins with behaviour, using objects, modifying environments, exploiting patterns. Many animals today exhibit proto-technological behaviours. Beavers reshape landscapes, ants farm fungi, birds weave intricate nests. None of these leave durable artefacts after millions of years, yet they represent complex, learned interactions with the environment. An early intelligent species might rely heavily on organic materials. Wood, fibre, hide, bone. These decay rapidly under most conditions. Even stone tools, if used sparingly or reshaped frequently, could be mistaken for natural fracture patterns once eroded and redeposited. Over hundreds of millions of years, the odds of preserving a clear, unambiguous signature of intentional manufacture drop dramatically. There is also the question of motivation. Human civilization is driven in part by surplus. Agriculture creates excess resources, which allow specialization, hierarchy, and large-scale construction. But agriculture itself depends on specific plant species, climates, and seasonal predictability. An earlier intelligence might follow a different path, one that does not emphasize permanent settlements or large structures. Such a society might be semi-nomadic, moving with environmental cycles rather than imposing rigid control over them. Knowledge could be carried in memory, ritual, and practice rather than external records. Tools could be simple, effective, and replaceable. The goal might not be expansion or accumulation, but balance. From our perspective, this would look like a lack of progress. From theirs, it might be stability. There is also the uncomfortable possibility that intelligence could rise and fall without ever reaching what we would call civilization. A lineage might achieve sophisticated cognition, social learning, and problem-solving, only to be wiped out by environmental change before it reshaped the planet in a lasting way. Evolution is full of experiments that worked for a time and then ended. Mass extinctions play a role here. The Earth has experienced several events where a majority of species disappeared in relatively short geological intervals. These events reset ecosystems. They remove dominant groups and create opportunities for others. If an intelligent lineage existed before such an event, it might vanish completely, leaving no descendants to carry forward its adaptations. Even without mass extinction, gradual change can erode the conditions that support intelligence. Climate shifts could reduce food availability. Habitat fragmentation could isolate populations. Competition could favour different strategies. Intelligence is not always the winning move. Sometimes simpler, faster, or more reproductively efficient organisms prevail. It is also worth questioning whether intelligence must be centralised in individuals. Collective intelligence exists. Social insects exhibit complex behaviours that emerge from simple rules followed by many individuals. While this is not intelligence in the human sense, it demonstrates that problem-solving and environmental manipulation can arise without large brains or conscious planning. Over deep time, hybrid strategies could evolve that blur these distinctions. Could there have been a species with moderate individual intelligence but strong collective memory and coordination? Possibly. Such a system might leave even fewer recognisable traces, especially if its structures were temporary or organic. Yet it could still shape ecosystems, influence evolutionary trajectories, and experience something akin to culture. One of the strongest biases we bring to this question is the idea that intelligence inevitably leads to visible dominance. Humans dominate because our particular combination of cognition, social structure, and technology happen to align in a way that scaled rapidly. That does not mean every intelligent species would follow the same path. Some might avoid overexploitation. Others might lack the social pressures that drive expansion. Some might even self-limit, intentionally or otherwise. Time itself complicates the picture. Millions of years offer plenty of opportunity for intelligence to arise, but they also guarantee profound change. Even if an early civilization lasted 1,000,000 years, an extraordinary span by human standards, it would still be a brief flicker in geological terms. After its disappearance, the Earth would continue to work, erasing surfaces, burying evidence, rearranging continents. When we search for intelligence in the past, we tend to look for ourselves. We look for symmetry, for regularity, for artifacts that fit our expectations. But an earlier intelligence might be genuinely alien, not because it came from elsewhere, but because it evolved under conditions we have never experienced. Its priorities, technologies, and expressions of knowledge could fall outside our conceptual categories. This does not mean we should accept speculation without restraint. Science relies on evidence, and extraordinary claims require strong support. But it does mean we should be careful about assuming that the absence of familiar evidence rules out unfamiliar possibilities. Deep time is not just long. It is actively destructive to most forms of record keeping. Geology preserves some things very well, but only under specific circumstances: rapid burial, low oxygen, minimal disturbance. Even then, what is preserved is biased toward hard parts, simple shapes, and chemical signatures that resist alteration. Soft tissues, behaviours, and social structures vanish almost entirely. So when we ask whether intelligence could have arisen earlier, the honest answer is not that it did or did not, but that the Earth's history allows for the possibility in ways that are often underestimated. Life has been complex for a very long time. Nervous systems have been experimenting with perception and decision-making for hundreds of millions of years. Environments have offered both challenge and opportunity across that same span. The question then shifts from whether it could happen to whether we would recognise it if it had. Recognition depends on assumptions. It depends on what we expect intelligence to leave behind. If those expectations are too narrow, we may be overlooking entire categories of past experience. As the continents slowly began to part, the pressures on any existing intelligent systems would increase. Connectivity would decline. Environments would shift. Isolation would intensify. Whether intelligence survived that transition, transformed itself, or disappeared entirely is something the Earth does not narrate explicitly. It simply continues. When we picture civilization, most of us reach for the same mental images without even realizing it. Dense cities, permanent buildings, written records, clear hierarchies, agriculture supporting large populations, tools that grow steadily more complex and durable over time. These assumptions are so deeply woven into our understanding of history that they feel almost unavoidable. Yet they are not universal truths about intelligence or social organization. They are descriptions of one particular path taken by one particular species under one particular set of conditions, very late in Earth's story. If we step back and remove those assumptions, the idea of civilization becomes far more flexible and far less dependent on visible monuments or lasting artifacts. Civilization, at its most basic level, is not about stone or metal. It is about coordination. It is about shared knowledge persisting beyond a single lifetime. It is about systems of behavior that allow a group to survive, adapt, and transmit understanding across generations. Everything else is optional. On a Pangian Earth, without continents to divide the world and without stable coastlines or predictable long-term geography, permanence would be a risky strategy. Building structures meant to last centuries might offer little advantage if the land itself is slowly shifting. Rivers change course, and climates drift over long spans. In such a setting, flexibility would matter more than durability. Knowledge that could move easily, adapt quickly, and live inside minds rather than walls would be far more valuable than anything carved into stone. A civilization shaped by those conditions might look almost invisible to us. Its cities could be seasonal gathering places rather than permanent settlements. Its infrastructure might consist of well-understood routes, shared signals, and environmental markers rather than roads or buildings. Its most important technologies could be social rather than mechanical. Ways of organising labour, resolving conflict, sharing resources, and teaching skills efficiently. Without agriculture as we know it, surplus could still exist, but it might take different forms: abundant seasonal resources, managed landscapes, or cooperative harvesting could provide reliability without fields or fences. Modern hunter-gatherer societies already demonstrate that complex social structures, trade networks, and cultural traditions can exist without farming or permanent architecture. Scale that up across a vast continuous landmass and extend it across deep time, and the result could be something sophisticated, yet materially light. Communication in such a civilization would likely rely heavily on memory, repetition, and ritual. Stories would not be entertainment alone. They would be storage devices, navigation instructions, ecological knowledge, social rules, and historical memory could all be embedded in narrative, song, or practice. These forms are remarkably resilient when actively maintained, but they leave almost nothing behind once the chain of transmission is broken. We often equate writing with civilization, but writing is only one solution to the problem of memory. It arises when societies grow large, sedentary, and administratively complex. A civilization that remains mobile, adaptable, and tightly integrated with its environment may never develop writing because it does not need to. Its knowledge would live in people, not in objects. Technology, too, would look different. Rather than accumulating layers of increasingly specialized tools, such a society might favor multi-purpose, easily replaced implements. Organic materials would dominate. Wood, fiber, plant resins, bone, and hide offer immense versatility, but they degrade quickly. Even stone, if used sparingly and opportunistically, might not stand out clearly in the archaeological record after enough time has passed. Energy use would also differ. Without fossil fuels or large-scale metallurgy, energy would come from muscle, fire, wind, water, and biological processes. Mastery of fire alone enables cooking, landscape management, tool production, and social cohesion. Fire leaves traces, but those traces are subtle and easily erased over millions of years, especially in dynamic environments shaped by erosion and sedimentation. Social organization might not resemble kingdoms or empires. Large, rigid hierarchies are fragile in changing environments. Instead, authority could be situational, based on expertise rather than position. Leadership might shift depending on context, hunting, navigation, conflict resolution, or environmental knowledge. Such systems can be highly effective without producing centralized power structures that leave obvious physical signatures. Trade networks could span enormous distances without formal infrastructure. Objects, ideas, and practices might move slowly from group to group, changing along the way. Over time, this creates shared cultural threads without uniformity. From our perspective, this would be difficult to distinguish from simple diffusion, yet it could represent a highly developed system of exchange. Another assumption worth questioning is the idea that civilization seeks expansion. Human history often emphasizes growth, accumulation, and control, but these traits are not inevitable. In a world as vast and interconnected as Pangaea, expansion might offer diminishing returns. Moving into unfamiliar territory could mean encountering harsher climates, different ecosystems, or unpredictable hazards. Stability might come from staying within known limits rather than pushing beyond them. If an early civilization adopted such a strategy, its footprint would remain light. It might deliberately avoid overexploiting resources, not out of abstract environmentalism, but because restraint ensured long-term survival. Over time, this would result in minimal ecological disruption compared to industrial societies. From a geological perspective, this would make the civilization almost invisible. Time perception would also differ. Without rigid schedules, calendars, or clocks, time would be experienced through cycles rather than units. Seasons, migrations, flowering periods, and animal behaviors would structure activity. Long-term changes would be noticed gradually, embedded in collective memory rather than measured precisely. This does not mean such a society would lack foresight. On the contrary, it might be acutely aware of slow trends, precisely because it depends so directly on them. Education would not be formalized in institutions. Learning would be continuous, contextual, and embodied. Skills would be acquired through participation rather than instruction. This mode of knowledge transmission is efficient and adaptable, but again, it leaves no durable artifacts. Once the practitioners are gone, the knowledge disappears with them. Conflict, when it occurred, would likely be small-scale and localized. Without fixed assets or permanent settlements, there would be less incentive for large destructive wars. This does not imply a peaceful utopia, but rather a pattern of conflict that does not produce mass graves, fortifications, or weapon stockpiles that might survive deep time. Even belief systems would be shaped by impermanence. Cosmologies might emphasize cycles, change, and adaptation rather than linear progress or eternal order. The Earth itself, constantly shifting, would be understood as something alive in a practical sense, not metaphorical, but experiential. Lands rise and fall. Waters come and go. Life adapts or disappears. Such a worldview would not need temples to reinforce it. It would be confirmed daily by observation. One of the most challenging ideas to accept is that a civilization could be advanced without being extractive. Modern progress is closely tied to altering the environment at large scales. Roads, mines, dams, cities, and waste products leave unmistakable marks. But intelligence does not require domination. It requires understanding. A civilization that prioritizes understanding over control might intentionally avoid actions that leave long-lasting scars, especially if those scars threaten future survival. This reframes the absence of evidence in an important way. Instead of asking why we have not found ruins, we might ask why we expect ruins to exist at all. Ruins are byproducts of particular choices. Different choices produce different legacies. It is also possible that such a civilization would leave traces we do not yet know how to interpret. Subtle alterations to ecosystems, patterns of species distribution influenced by intentional movement, genetic signatures of selective breeding that predate known agricultural timelines, chemical anomalies in sediments that suggest controlled fire use over long periods. These signals are difficult to distinguish from natural processes, especially when filtered through hundreds of millions of years of change. Modern archaeology is tuned to relatively recent timescales. It excels at finding stone tools tens of thousands of years old, or structures thousands of years old. It is far less effective at detecting behavioural complexity in deep time, especially when that behaviour does not rely on durable materials. If civilization without our assumptions existed, it would challenge not just our understanding of the past, but our definition of progress. It would suggest that intelligence can choose paths other than accumulation and permanence. It would imply that survival over deep time may favour adaptability and restraint over expansion and monument building. As the continents began to separate, such a civilization would face new pressures. Roots would break, contacts would weaken, environmental zones would fragment. Some groups might adapt to emerging coastlines, others might remain inland. Over time, shared knowledge could diverge until it was no longer shared at all. What began as a coherent system could dissolve into isolated traditions, then fade entirely as conditions changed. From our vantage point, millions of years later, we would see none of this directly. We would see continents drifting apart. We would see fossils of plants and animals. We would see chemical signatures of ancient climates. The social complexity, the decision-making, the understanding that once guided lives across a unified world would be gone without a trace. Thinking this way does not require believing that such a civilization definitely existed. It requires only acknowledging that our criteria for recognizing civilization are narrow, shaped by our own experience, rather than by the full range of possibilities life might explore. When those criteria are loosened, the deep past becomes less empty, not because we fill it with fantasies, but because we recognize how little we can reasonably expect to find. When people imagine clues to an ancient civilization, they often picture something obvious waiting to be uncovered. A carved wall, a buried city, a tool so clearly shaped that no natural process could explain it away. This expectation makes sense when dealing with recent history, where time has not yet had the chance to grind everything down. But once we move into the depths of geological time, the idea of clear, unmistakable evidence becomes unrealistic. What remains from those eras is not a record carefully kept, but a patchwork of survivors, fragments, and absences. The clues, if they exist at all, are quiet, indirect, and easy to overlook. Stone is often treated as the most reliable witness of the past. Rocks endure when almost everything else disappears. Yet even stone is not permanent. It fractures, dissolves, recrystallizes, and melts. Over millions of years, it is folded deep into the earth, transformed by pressure and heat, and returned to the surface in altered forms. Any structure built of stone during the time of Pangaea would face these forces repeatedly. Even mountains, which seem immovable to us, are temporary features on geological timescales. If entire mountain ranges can vanish, there is little reason to expect smaller constructions to remain recognizable. That does not mean stone holds no information. It simply means the information is encoded differently. Instead of shapes and surfaces, it preserves chemistry, layering, and stress patterns. These are read not with the naked eye, but with instruments and context. Subtle anomalies in rock formations can indicate past conditions that were unusual. Rapid deposition where slow accumulation is expected. Repeated disturbance in layers that should be stable. Materials appearing together that normally do not form in the same environments. None of these screams civilization, but they hint that something interrupted the natural rhythm. Fossils present a similar challenge. Fossilization is rare. Most organisms never fossilize at all. Soft-bodied creatures vanish almost completely from the record. Even among those with hard parts, only a tiny fraction are preserved, and an even smaller fraction are found. The fossil record is therefore not a complete archive of life, but a biased sampling shaped by chance. We see what had bones, shells, or durable structures, and what happened to die in the right place under the right conditions. If an early civilization relied heavily on organic materials as discussed before, its members would leave few direct traces. Their bodies might fossilize under rare circumstances, but distinguishing them from other animals would require clear anatomical markers. Intelligence itself does not fossilize. Behavior does not fossilize. Social organization does not fossilize. At best, we might see indirect signs, patterns that suggest something more than instinctual activity. For example, controlled use of fire leaves traces in the fossil record, but these traces are subtle. Charcoal layers can indicate burning, but distinguishing natural wildfires from intentional, repeated fire use over long periods is difficult. Over millions of years, charcoal can be eroded, redeposited, or chemically altered. Even if a pattern existed, it might blend into the background noise of a world where fire was already a natural force. Tool use is another potential clue, but again, the signal fades quickly with time. Stone tools from early humans are identifiable because they show repeated intentional flaking patterns and are preserved in relatively young sediments. Push those same tools back hundreds of millions of years, subject them to tectonic movement, erosion, and redeposition, and those patterns blur. Edges wear down. Context is lost. What was once a tool becomes just another oddly shaped rock in a chaotic deposit. Then there are gaps. Absences in the record are often dismissed as lack of data, but sometimes they are data. Sudden changes in species distribution, unexpected disappearances not clearly tied to climate or volcanic activity, ecosystems that reorganize without an obvious trigger. These gaps invite explanation, though they do not provide it outright. Consider how human activity appears in the geological record today. We leave behind plastics, altered sedimentation patterns, unusual chemical signatures, and rapid changes in species abundance. But even these signals, dramatic as they are now, would fade over millions of years. Plastics would break down, cities would erode, chemical anomalies would diffuse. Eventually, future geologists might detect only a brief puzzling layer of disruption, if that. Scale that backward to a civilization that was less extractive, less industrial, and more integrated with its environment. Its signature would be correspondingly fainter. It might show up as a slightly accelerated spread of certain species, perhaps moved intentionally. It might appear as repeated landscape modification that mimics natural processes closely enough to be misattributed. It might leave behind nothing more than statistical oddities that only become noticeable when large datasets are compared. Another quiet clue lies in mineral deposits. Certain minerals form only under specific conditions. If those conditions appear out of place, they raise questions. However, geology already offers many natural explanations for such anomalies. High heat, unusual pressure, chemical reactions driven by volcanic activity, or rare environmental circumstances can all produce unexpected results. Introducing intelligence as an explanation requires ruling out all of these possibilities, a standard that is difficult to meet even for far more recent events. The same applies to isotopic signatures. Isotopes can reveal information about past temperatures, atmospheric composition, and biological activity. Shifts in these signatures can indicate changes in how carbon, oxygen, or nitrogen moved through the environment. Life itself alters these cycles. A widespread, coordinated activity by intelligent organisms could, in theory, leave a detectable imprint. But again, disentangling that signal from natural biological evolution is extraordinarily challenging. Perhaps the most intriguing clues are not objects or layers, but patterns. Patterns in extinction and survival. Patterns in evolutionary bursts. Patterns in how quickly ecosystems recover after disruption. Intelligence, if it reached a certain threshold, could influence these patterns without leaving obvious physical traces. Selective pressures might change subtly. Certain species might persist longer than expected. Others might spread unusually quickly. Yet pattern recognition depends heavily on interpretation. With enough data, almost any pattern can be explained in multiple ways. Without a clear causal mechanism, intelligence becomes just one hypothesis among many, and often not the most parsimonious one. Science tends to favour explanations that rely on known processes rather than speculative ones, especially when evidence is ambiguous. This brings us to the role of gaps in our own understanding. The deep past is not just missing artifacts, it is missing context. We do not know what questions to ask in many cases, because our questions are shaped by our own experience. We look for cities because we live in cities. We look for tools because we use tools in certain ways. We look for writing because writing matters to us. An early civilization might prioritize things we do not measure. Even intelligence itself may not present in ways we would recognize as such. Decision-making distributed across groups. Long-term environmental management embedded in cultural norms. Communication systems based on sound, gesture, or chemical signals that leave no trace. These are not science fiction concepts. They exist in various forms among modern organisms. Scaled up and refined over millions of years, they could support complex societies without obvious material output. One of the quietest clues is simply the longevity of life on Earth. Complex life has existed for over 500 million years. That is a long time for evolution to explore possibilities. Humans often feel like the inevitable result of that process, but evolution has no foresight. It tries many paths. Most end. Some persist for astonishing lengths of time without ever leading to industrial civilization. If intelligence arose earlier and then vanished, its disappearance would not require a dramatic marker. No singular layer announcing its end. It could fade as conditions changed, as connectivity was lost, as environments shifted beyond its adaptive range. From the perspective of the fossil record, this would look like normal turnover, not a mystery demanding explanation. This is uncomfortable because it suggests limits to what we can know. Science thrives on evidence, and rightly so. But the Earth's memory is selective, and deep time is an aggressive editor. Entire chapters of the planet's story may be reduced to footnotes, or erased entirely, not because they were unimportant, but because the medium could not preserve them. Acknowledging this does not weaken science. It strengthens it by clarifying its boundaries. It reminds us that certainty decreases as we move further back, not because the past becomes more chaotic, but because the signals grow quieter. Listening for those signals requires humility as much as ingenuity. As research methods improve, new types of clues may emerge. Statistical analyses of large-scale geological data, improved models of ancient ecosystems, better understanding of how intelligent behavior might influence environments without dominating them. These approaches may not reveal a lost civilization outright, but they can refine our sense of what is plausible. For now, the quiet clues remain just that, quiet. They sit in stone that has been folded and refolded, in fossils that represent a fraction of what once lived, in gaps where something might have been or might not. They do not point clearly in any one direction. They simply remind us that the Earth's past is deeper and more complex than the narrow slice we usually examine. From this perspective, the question is not whether we have missed something obvious, but whether we are prepared to recognize subtlety when it appears. Because if intelligence once moved through a world without borders, building systems without monuments and knowledge without records, the traces it left behind would not announce themselves loudly. They would blend into the background of a planet that has always been very good at keeping its secrets, even as it continues without pause into whatever comes next. At some point, without drama and without any clear signal that could be understood in a single lifetime, the ground itself began to behave differently. Not suddenly, not violently at first, but with a kind of slow insistence that only geology can manage. What had once felt solid and continuous started to stretch. Not enough to be alarming, not enough to be obvious, just enough to matter over time. The breakup of Pangaea did not begin as a catastrophe. It began as tension. Deep beneath the surface, heat accumulated. The mantle stirred. Convection currents shifted their slow patterns, and the enormous plates riding above them responded, not with sharp breaks, but with gradual strain. Like a piece of thick clay pulled gently from opposite ends, the supercontinent did not crack immediately. It thinned. From the perspective of anything living on the surface, the world still felt whole. Rivers still flowed, forests still grew, animals still followed their familiar paths. If an intelligent civilization existed at this time, its members would not wake one morning to find the land tearing open beneath their feet. There would be no announcement that the Age of Unity was ending. Instead, there would be small changes, scattered and easy to rationalize. In some regions, the ground might begin to sink slightly. Valleys would deepen in places where they had once been shallow. Lakes could form where drainage patterns subtly altered. Elsewhere, volcanic activity might increase, not in explosive bursts, but as persistent eruptions along long linear zones. Lava would seep, spread, cool, and harden, adding layer upon layer of new rock to the surface. These features are familiar to geologists today: rift valleys, flood basalts, stretched crust. But to those living through them, they would simply be part of the landscape's slow evolution. A place that had always been dry becomes wetter. A region known for stability becomes unpredictable. Travel routes grow longer as terrain roughens. None of this points clearly to a planet-scale transformation. It feels local, manageable, temporary. Rifting does not happen evenly. Stress concentrates along weak zones in the crust, often where ancient structures already exist. These zones become lines of vulnerability, places where the Earth prefers to give way. Over time, they lengthen, connect, and deepen. What begins as a series of disconnected basins slowly organizes into a coherent system. As this process unfolds, the crust thins further. Magma rises more easily. Heat escapes more efficiently. The land stretches beyond its ability to recover. Eventually, seawater finds its way in. A shallow sea floods the rift, marking the first true physical separation, where once there was only land. But even this moment is deceptive. The sea does not arrive as an ocean. It creeps. It forms narrow gulfs and shallow bays. For generations, it might advance and retreat with changing sea levels. Crossing it might still be possible at certain times or places. The sense of separation is incomplete. For a civilization that had grown accustomed to a connected world, these changes would introduce friction rather than finality. Communication between regions would slow. Journeys would require new skills. Boats, if they existed, would need to adapt to salt water rather than rivers or lakes. Knowledge that once travelled easily would now depend on fewer, more fragile pathways. Importantly, this separation would not affect all regions equally. Some parts of Pangaea would remain firmly connected for tens of millions of years after rifting began elsewhere. The supercontinent didn't split neatly down the middle. It fragmented asymmetrically, creating a patchwork of connected and semi-isolated zones. This unevenness matters. It means that any existing social or cultural systems would fracture in stages. Some groups would experience isolation early, others would remain part of a larger network much longer. The result would not be a single moment of collapse, but a prolonged process of differentiation. Environmental consequences would compound these effects. As rifts widened and seas formed, global circulation patterns changed. Ocean currents reorganized. Atmospheric circulation shifted. Regions that once received regular rainfall might dry out. Others could become wetter. Temperature gradients altered. Over long spans, these changes reshaped ecosystems. An intelligent civilization adapted to earlier conditions would now face choices: remain where resources are declining, relying on memory and tradition, or move toward newly favourable areas, accepting uncertainty and risk. Neither option guarantees success. Adaptation requires not just flexibility, but foresight. And foresight is difficult when change unfolds slowly but relentlessly. The ground pulling itself apart also introduces new hazards. Earthquakes become more common along rift zones. Volcanic gases alter air quality. Ashfall affects vegetation. While none of these events are necessarily world-ending, their cumulative impact can strain societies, especially those finely tuned to previous conditions. From our perspective, these geological processes are well understood. We have models, timelines, and reconstructions. But it is easy to underestimate how disorienting such gradual change would be from within. Humans today struggle to respond to climate shifts occurring over decades. A civilization without modern measurement tools, facing changes over centuries or millennia, would experience them as persistent background instability rather than a clear trend. As connections weaken, cultural divergence accelerates. Shared practices adapt to local conditions, language shifts, techniques evolve independently. Even if a common origin remains in collective memory, practical differences grow. What works in one region no longer works in another. Over time, mutual understanding erodes. This is not necessarily a failure of intelligence, it is a consequence of scale. Large connected systems require maintenance. They rely on regular exchange, shared reference points, and synchronized knowledge. When geography undermines those mechanisms, fragmentation becomes the default outcome. The breaking of Pangaea also alters the biological context in which civilization exists. As landmasses separate, species distributions change. Some populations become isolated and diverge evolutionarily. Others migrate along new coastlines. Food webs reorganize. Resources that were once predictable become variable. For any society dependent on the environment, these changes demand continual adjustment. Strategies that once ensured stability may become liabilities. Practices embedded in tradition might resist change until adaptation becomes urgent, perhaps too late. From the geological record, we know that the breakup of Pangaea coincided with significant biological turnover. While not as dramatic as some mass extinctions, this period saw shifts in dominant species and the emergence of new lineages. Environmental stress favours adaptability. It also eliminates those unable to respond. If an early civilization existed, it would be subject to the same pressures. Intelligence does not grant immunity to environmental change. It only provides tools to respond, and those tools are constrained by available resources, social structure, and accumulated knowledge. One of the most subtle consequences of continental breakup is the loss of redundancy. In a connected world, failure in one region can be compensated by support from another. Resources can be shared. Knowledge can be redistributed. When connections break, local failures become more dangerous. A drought, disease, or ecological collapse that might once have been survivable becomes catastrophic in isolation. Over long spans, this leads to attrition. Some groups adapt successfully, others dwindle. Some disappear entirely. From the outside, this looks like normal population turnover. From within, it feels like the slow narrowing of options. The Earth, meanwhile, continues its work without pause. Rifts widen into oceans. New crust forms at spreading centres. Old crust sinks elsewhere. The planet moves on to a new configuration, indifferent to what once depended on the old one. What remains from this process, millions of years later, is a transformed world. Separate continents, distinct ecosystems, new evolutionary trajectories. The unity of Pangaea becomes a reconstruction, inferred from matching coastlines and shared rock formations. Any civilization that arose during the Age of Unity would now be scattered across fragments of that world, if it survived at all. Its story would not be written in ruins but dissolved into geology. Its end would not be marked by a line in stone, but by gradual disconnection, adaptation, and loss. This way of ending is quiet. It does not resemble the dramatic collapses we imagine when thinking about civilizations. There is no single cause, no final battle, no clear moment of disappearance. There is only change accumulating until the system that once worked no longer functions as a whole. Understanding this helps reframe the question of disappearance. It suggests that civilizations can fade not because they fail, but because the context that supported them no longer exists. The ground does not need to open dramatically. It only needs to keep moving, patiently, until the world becomes something else entirely. To live in a world that is slowly tearing itself apart is to inhabit a reality where nothing feels urgent, yet nothing truly stays the same. The change does not announce itself with a single moment of disaster. There is no day that becomes legend as the beginning of the end. Instead, there is a long stretch of ordinary life, threaded through with small disruptions that seem manageable on their own, but which quietly accumulate until the shape of the world is no longer what it once was. For those living on Pangaea, as it began to separate, daily existence would still revolve around familiar needs. Finding food, maintaining shelter, raising offspring, sharing knowledge. The sun would rise and set as it always had. Seasons would still follow their cycles, animals would migrate, plants would bloom and wither. On the scale of a human lifetime, or even many lifetimes, the Earth would appear mostly stable. That illusion of stability is precisely what makes slow planetary change so powerful. At first, the signs would be local. A river behaves differently than it used to. Floods become more frequent in one region, while another begins to dry out. The ground trembles now and then, not violently, but enough to be noticed and discussed. Volcanic vents appear where none were remembered. Some areas become difficult to traverse, while others open up in new ways. Each of these changes can be explained without invoking a global transformation. People are very good at normalizing gradual change. Communities would adapt in practical ways. Paths are rerouted, seasonal movements are adjusted, knowledge is updated. Oral histories begin to include references to places that used to be different. Elders speak of landscapes remembered from youth that no longer exist in the same form. None of this feels apocalyptic. It feels like adaptation, the same process that life has always relied on. Yet beneath these adjustments, something more profound is happening. The connective tissue of the world is weakening. Routes that once linked distant regions become longer, more hazardous, or less reliable. Journeys that once took weeks now take months, or cannot be completed at all at certain times of year. Communication slows, not because people forget how to speak to one another, but because the physical act of reaching one another becomes harder. For any civilization, connection is not a luxury. It is a stabilizing force. Shared knowledge prevents local failures from becoming permanent losses. Techniques refined in one region can spread to others. Social bonds across distance reduce the impact of local disasters. When those connections thin, societies become more vulnerable, even if they remain intelligent and adaptable. Living through this thinning would feel subtle at first. Fewer visitors arrive from distant regions. News takes longer to reach familiar places. Customs begin to diverge slightly. Words change meaning. Practices that were once shared become localized. None of this is inherently negative. Diversity increases. Local solutions flourish. But something is lost as well, the sense of belonging to a single, continuous world. Environmental changes would reinforce this fragmentation. As rifts widen and seas intrude, weather patterns shift. Regions that once shared similar climates begin to diverge. Rainfall increases in some areas, while decreasing in others. Temperatures fluctuate in new ways. Ecosystems reorganize, favoring different species. Food sources change, sometimes unpredictably. For people living through this, the challenge is not just physical, but cognitive. Humans and other intelligent beings are excellent at responding to immediate threats, but less adept at perceiving slow directional change. When conditions worsen gradually, it is easy to believe that the next season will return to normal, that a familiar balance will reassert itself. Hope becomes a coping strategy, but also a trap. Adaptation requires recognizing when old assumptions no longer hold. Agricultural practices, if they exist, might fail as climate shifts. Foraging routes could become unreliable. Water sources might disappear or become saline. These changes force difficult decisions: stay and adjust, or move and risk the unknown. Each choice carries costs, and neither guarantees success. Mobility, which may have been an advantage in a unified world, becomes more complex as geography fragments. Crossing newly formed seas requires new technologies, new skills, and new risks. Boats, if developed, must contend with tides, storms, and navigation without familiar landmarks. Not all communities will make this transition successfully. Those that do may become coastal specialists, while others retreat inland and lose contact entirely. Psychologically, living through such a transition would reshape how people think about place. Land that once felt permanent becomes uncertain. Sacred sites may be submerged or cut off. Ancestral roots disappear. Identity tied to specific landscapes must be renegotiated. This can be destabilizing, especially for cultures that ground meaning in continuity. At the same time, new opportunities emerge. Coastlines create rich ecological zones. Shallow seas teem with life. New resources become available. Societies that adapt quickly may thrive in these environments, developing new skills and knowledge. Change is not uniformly destructive. It redistributes advantage, often unpredictably. However, redistribution also breeds inequality. Regions favoured by new conditions gain resilience, while others become marginal. Support from distant allies is no longer assured. Local failures become more consequential. A prolonged drought, a disease outbreak, or the loss of a key resource can push a community past its ability to recover. Over generations, these pressures shape culture. Norms may shift toward caution, flexibility, or short-term planning. Long-term projects become riskier when the future environment is uncertain. Monumental construction, if it existed at all, becomes less attractive. Knowledge systems may emphasize adaptability over preservation. Memory itself changes under these conditions. Stories of the old world become less concrete, more symbolic. Children grow up knowing only fragments of what once was. Over time, the idea of a unified landmass may feel mythical rather than historical. What was once lived experience becomes legend, then fades entirely. This process does not require catastrophe. It requires only enough disruption to prevent continuity. Civilization, if defined as a sustained system of shared knowledge and coordination, depends on continuity. When continuity breaks, civilization fragments, even if intelligence remains. It is important to note that this fragmentation does not imply a sudden end. Life goes on, people continue to think, learn, and adapt. But the scale at which coordination occurs shrinks. What was once global becomes regional. What was regional becomes local. What was shared becomes particular. From a geological perspective, this is unremarkable. The Earth has seen many such transitions. From a lived perspective, it is transformative. It reshapes how beings relate to one another and to the world they inhabit. As oceans widen and continents drift farther apart, isolation deepens. Evolutionary divergence accelerates, not just biologically, but culturally. Practices that work in one environment fail in another. Over time, even the possibility of reconnection diminishes. The distances become too great. The knowledge required to cross them is lost or never developed. What remains are pockets of adaptation, each tuned to its local conditions, each carrying a fragment of what once was a larger system. From the outside, millions of years later, this looks like ordinary turnover. Species appear and disappear. Ecosystems shift. Continents separate. There is no obvious marker of a civilization that lived through the transition. This is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of slow planetary change. It does not erase intelligence. It erases memory. It does not destroy life outright. It dissolves context. Without context, achievements become meaningless, indistinguishable from background noise. Living through a world that is slowly tearing in two would teach a harsh lesson. Not that everything ends suddenly, but that endings can be stretched so thin they become invisible. That survival does not guarantee remembrance. That intelligence, no matter how refined, remains embedded in the conditions that support it. Movement did not begin as a response to crisis. Long before the planet started to pull itself apart in earnest, life on Pangaea was already in motion. Animals followed seasons, plants spread where conditions allowed, rivers carried nutrients, seeds, and organisms across great distances. Travel in this sense was not an emergency measure. It was the default state of a living world. What changed during the slow breakup of the supercontinent was not the existence of movement, but its meaning. As the land began to fracture, migration stopped being merely cyclical or opportunistic, and started becoming directional. Not overnight, and not in a way that anyone could clearly label at the time, but gradually, as familiar paths grew unreliable and formerly stable regions demanded more effort to sustain life. For any intelligent beings living through this era, movement would increasingly carry weight. It would shape survival, memory, and identity in ways that had never been necessary before. At first, migrations would look ordinary. A group shifts its seasonal range slightly farther than usual. Another chooses to remain longer near a river that now flows more consistently. Small decisions made for practical reasons accumulate. Over generations, these choices produce new patterns. Areas once lightly occupied become hubs. Other regions thin out. The land itself begins to feel uneven, not because it changed suddenly, but because its reliability did. As rift zones widened and shallow seas crept inland, some traditional overland routes would become marshy, then impassable. Lowlands that once connected distant regions turn into barriers rather than corridors. Travellers are forced to detour, extending journeys and increasing risk. Information, which once flowed steadily through repeated contact, begins to lag. News arrives late, incomplete, or not at all. For societies that rely on shared knowledge, this lag matters. Environmental warnings arrive too late to be useful. Techniques developed elsewhere fail to spread. Adaptation becomes localized. Intelligence, which thrives on exchange, begins to operate in smaller circles. Migration under these conditions is no longer just about following resources. It becomes a strategy for preserving continuity. Groups that move successfully carry with them not just people, but accumulated understanding. Practices that evolved over long periods are transported into new environments, where they may or may not remain effective. Each migration becomes an experiment, testing whether knowledge forged under one set of conditions can survive under another. Crossing newly formed bodies of water introduces an entirely new dimension. Even narrow seas change the calculus of movement. Water behaves differently than land. It demands tools, skills, and trust in abstract navigation rather than visible paths. Not all societies will attempt such crossings. Those that do may gain access to new territories, but they also risk losing contact with their origins entirely. This creates a divergence between movers and stayers. Some groups choose to adapt in place, refining their strategies to cope with changing conditions. Others choose mobility, accepting uncertainty in exchange for opportunity. Neither choice is inherently superior. Both involve trade-offs. Staying preserves familiarity, but risks entrapment. Moving opens possibilities, but threatens continuity. Over time, these choices reshape populations. Movers encounter new ecosystems, new pressures, and new constraints. They may thrive, or they may fail. Those that succeed carry fragments of earlier cultures into unfamiliar contexts, where they blend with local influences. Over generations, these fragments transform. What remains recognizable fades. Meanwhile, those who stay behind face their own challenges. As conditions deteriorate or resources shift, maintaining stability requires increasing effort. Practices that once worked effortlessly now demand constant adjustment. Without external input, innovation may slow. Adaptation becomes reactive rather than exploratory. The breaking planet amplifies these dynamics by introducing asymmetry. Not all migrations are equal. Some regions become funnels, concentrating movement. Others become dead ends. Geography begins to dictate fate more strongly. Access to emerging coastlines, navigable waters, or fertile new zones confers advantage. Isolation becomes a liability. Importantly, migration is not always voluntary. Environmental stress can force movement even when cultural or emotional ties encourage staying. Flooding, salinization of soil, loss of prey species, or changes in vegetation can render regions untenable. In such cases, migration becomes an act of survival rather than choice. Forced migration disrupts social structures. Elders lose authority when experience no longer applies. Traditions tied to specific landscapes lose relevance. Younger members may adapt more easily, but at the cost of continuity. Knowledge transmission falters when the environment that gave it meaning disappears. As migrations accumulate, the sense of a shared past erodes. Different groups remember different origins, stories diverge. What was once a unified narrative becomes a collection of localized histories. Over time, even the idea that these groups once belonged to a larger whole may be forgotten. From the outside, looking back millions of years later, this appears as dispersion. Species ranges shift. Populations spread and differentiate. Nothing about this suggests intelligence or intention. It looks like normal biological response to changing conditions, and that is precisely the problem. Intelligent migration does not leave a distinct geological signature. Even large-scale human migrations leave surprisingly little trace once physical structures erode. What remains are genetic patterns and subtle cultural echoes, both of which blur quickly over deep time. For a civilization existing during the breakup of Pangaea, the same processes would apply, but amplified by time and geological upheaval. Consider the scale involved. A migration spanning thousands of kilometers across a continuous landmass would be remarkable by human standards, yet trivial by geological ones. The routes taken might cross regions that are later submerged, uplifted, or erased. The sediments that record the journey would be scattered, compressed, or transformed. The evidence would fragment beyond recognition. Genetic signals might persist longer, but even these are not permanent. Lineages diverge, mutations accumulate, bottlenecks and extinctions prune branches. After enough time, ancestry becomes statistical rather than traceable. The story of movement dissolves into noise. Migration also affects how intelligence expresses itself. Mobile societies prioritize different skills than sedentary ones. Navigation, memory, adaptability, and social coordination become paramount. Long-term construction and accumulation become less practical. Knowledge becomes lighter, more portable, more flexible. This shift reinforces the invisibility of such societies to the distant future. The more mobile and adaptable a civilization becomes, the fewer durable traces it leaves behind. Success in this context is measured by persistence rather than imprint. As the planet continues to break apart, migration corridors narrow further. Oceans widen. Crossing points disappear. What began as movement across land becomes movement along coasts, then across water, then not at all. At each stage, fewer groups make the transition. Those that do become increasingly isolated from their origins. Eventually, migration reaches its limit. The distances are too great, the risks too high. Knowledge required to cross vast oceans without instruments is lost or never developed. Populations settle into the fragments of the former whole, now distinct continents drifting apart. At this point, any civilization that once spanned Pangaea exists only as disconnected remnants, if it exists at all. Shared systems collapse not because intelligence fails, but because geography no longer supports them. What remains are local adaptations, each shaped by new conditions, each unaware of the broader history that once connected them. This outcome challenges the assumption that migration always spreads civilization. Under certain conditions, migration preserves intelligence in the short term, but erodes it at scale. Without sustained connectivity, complex systems fragment. Over time, complexity simplifies, not because it is inferior, but because it cannot be maintained. The first migrations across a breaking planet would therefore be both a testament to adaptability and a prelude to loss. They allow life to survive change, but they also mark the beginning of divergence that makes reunification impossible. The planet does not forbid intelligence, it simply refuses to hold still long enough for it to remain unified. What survives when the land itself refuses to stay in one piece is not stone, not structures, and not even people, but patterns of understanding carried for as long as they can be carried. Knowledge does not exist on its own. It lives inside relationships, routines, habits, and shared expectations. When continents drift and connections weaken, knowledge is not erased all at once. It thins, stretches, and eventually breaks along the same fault lines as the world beneath it. In a unified landmass, knowledge has reach. It moves outward from its point of origin, carried by travellers, exchanged through cooperation, refined through comparison. A solution discovered in one place can migrate slowly across thousands of kilometres, adapted along the way, tested against different environments. Memory, in this context, is collective. No single group needs to remember everything, because the wider system holds redundancy. If something is forgotten in one region, it may still persist elsewhere and return through contact. Continental drift undermines this redundancy in ways that are almost invisible at first. Routes lengthen. Travel becomes seasonal rather than routine. Encounters become less frequent. Knowledge still moves, but more slowly and with more distortion. Each transfer becomes an opportunity for misunderstanding, simplification, or loss. Over generations, these small degradations accumulate. Memory behaves differently depending on how it is stored. Written records, if they exist, are fragile over deep time but robust over shorter spans. Oral traditions are remarkably resilient when actively maintained, but vulnerable to interruption. Practices embedded in daily life persist as long as the conditions that make them useful remain in place. When environments change, those practices lose relevance and are abandoned, often without conscious decision. As continents separate, environments diverge. Rainfall patterns shift, temperatures change, ecosystems reorganize, knowledge that once ensured survival may no longer apply. A hunting strategy effective in open plains becomes useless in dense coastal wetlands. Navigation methods suited to land routes fail at sea. Agricultural cycles tuned to one climate become liabilities in another. When knowledge stops working, it stops being taught. This is not because people become less intelligent, but because intelligence is selective. Time and attention are invested in what produces results. Practices that no longer yield benefits fade quickly, even if they were once central to cultural identity. Memory is practical before it is sentimental. This creates a paradox. The more rapidly the world changes, the less capacity a society has to preserve long-term memory. Adaptation crowds out remembrance. Innovation replaces tradition. Over time, the past becomes compressed into simplified narratives, stripped of technical detail. What remains is symbolic rather than functional. Culture follows the same trajectory. In a connected world, culture is layered. New elements accumulate atop older ones. Differences exist, but shared reference points remain. Under continental drift, culture fragments. Isolation accelerates divergence. Shared rituals evolve independently. Language shifts. Meanings drift. After enough time, mutual intelligibility disappears. This process does not require conflict. It arises naturally from separation. Even groups that begin with identical practices will diverge when exposed to different constraints. The drift is gradual but relentless. Cultural continuity requires contact, and contact becomes harder as oceans widen. Knowledge transmission also depends on trust. Information from distant sources must be evaluated. In a connected world, repeated interaction builds reliability. Under increasing isolation, unfamiliar practices are more likely to be rejected. Local solutions feel safer. External ideas lose authority. This further slows the movement of knowledge. Memory at scale becomes local. Each group remembers its own history, framed by its own landscape. Stories of distant origins become abstract, then mythic, then irrelevant. Eventually, the idea that these groups were once part of a larger whole may vanish entirely. Not forgotten consciously, but rendered meaningless by lack of context. From a geological perspective, this looks like nothing at all. No layer records the moment when a shared tradition diverged into many. No fossil captures the loss of a navigational method or the abandonment of a seasonal gathering. These changes leave no durable trace. They are real, but ephemeral. This is one of the most difficult aspects of deep time speculation to accept. Intelligence and culture can exist without producing anything that survives long enough to be studied. The absence of evidence is not just a problem of preservation. It is a consequence of how knowledge behaves under changing conditions. Even within human history, the loss of knowledge is common. Techniques disappear. Languages die. Entire ways of understanding the world vanish within a few centuries. Multiply this fragility by millions of years, and the expectation that anything recognizable should remain becomes unreasonable. Continental drift also alters the rhythm of cultural exchange. In a unified landmass, innovation spreads outward like ripples. Under fragmentation, innovation becomes punctuated. Breakthroughs occur locally, then stall. Parallel solutions emerge independently in different regions, similar but not shared. Over time, this creates the illusion of independent origin, even if the underlying ideas once had a common source. This complicates interpretation. Similar practices found on separate continents millions of years later would not necessarily indicate shared heritage. They could represent convergent adaptation to similar environments. Without continuous transmission, origin becomes ambiguous. Memory systems themselves evolve under these pressures. Societies facing instability may prioritize short-term knowledge over long-term accumulation. Planning horizons shrink. Cultural emphasis shifts toward flexibility rather than preservation. In such contexts, memory becomes dynamic rather than archival. If an early civilization existed during the breakup of Pangaea, its most sophisticated achievements might not be technological at all, but cognitive. Systems for rapid learning, methods for integrating newcomers, social structures that tolerate change. These achievements would leave no physical trace, yet they could determine survival. As isolation deepens, even these systems strain. Smaller populations carry less collective memory. Losses become harder to replace. Innovation slows not because intelligence declines, but because the pool of experience shrinks. Over time, complexity can simplify. This simplification should not be confused with regression. It is a response to constraint. Maintaining complex systems requires energy, stability, and redundancy. When those conditions disappear, complexity becomes a liability. Simplification preserves functionality. From the outside, this process is indistinguishable from decline. From the inside, it is adaptation. Knowledge is not lost all at once. It is shed deliberately piece by piece as circumstances demand. The slow nature of continental drift ensures that this shedding feels natural. No one decides to forget. No one announces the end of an era. The world simply stops rewarding certain forms of understanding, and attention moves elsewhere. Eventually, what remains of any once shared civilization is distributed across separated continents as unrelated traditions. Each believes itself complete. None remembers the whole. Intelligence persists, but its scale is reduced. This is perhaps the most sobering implication of deep time. Not that civilizations must fall, but that continuity is fragile. It depends not only on intelligence, but on geography's willingness to cooperate. When the planet withdraws that cooperation, memory fractures along with the land. As continents continue to drift, the fate of culture becomes increasingly tied to isolation. Knowledge that cannot cross oceans becomes local. Memory that cannot be reinforced fades. Civilization, once global in scope, becomes a series of disconnected experiments. Long after the first fractures appeared in the land, long after shallow seas crept into low valleys and turned familiar routes into uncertain crossings, the oceans began to do what they do best. They widened, they deepened, they erased. What had once been a continuous surface, crossed by paths worn through repetition and memory, slowly transformed into a planet where distance was no longer measured only in effort, but in impossibility. Roads, in the sense of deliberate construction, may or may not have existed in any early civilization, but routes certainly did. Repeated movement creates pathways even without intention. Trails emerge where feet pass often. River corridors become highways of travel. Seasonal circuits form predictable loops. These are roads in every practical sense, even if they leave no stone behind. They exist as habits carved into the landscape and reinforced by memory. Oceans are uniquely effective at destroying such systems. Unlike forests that can be cut through again, or deserts that can be crossed with preparation, open water severs continuity completely once it reaches sufficient width. A route that once required endurance suddenly requires a different kind of knowledge altogether. Navigation replaces navigation by land. Visibility gives way to abstraction. Landmarks disappear beyond the horizon. At first, the change is partial. A land bridge floods seasonally. A coastal route becomes unreliable at certain times of year. Crossings are still possible with planning and luck. These moments favour experimentation. Rafts, boats, flotation devices, or simple coastal hopping strategies emerge where necessity pushes innovation. Some groups adapt, others avoid the risk and turn inward. As oceans widen further, adaptation becomes specialization. Those who succeed at crossing water develop distinct skills and identities. Coastal knowledge becomes central. Currents, tides, winds, and stars gain importance. Meanwhile, inland groups lose familiarity with the sea. For them, water becomes an edge rather than a corridor. This divergence reshapes civilization more deeply than climate alone ever could. Land routes allow gradual exchange. Water routes enforce thresholds. Either you can cross or you cannot. There is little middle ground. Once that threshold is crossed, reconnection becomes rare and eventually impossible. Mountains play a quieter but equally decisive role. Unlike oceans, they do not always prevent movement outright. They slow it, they filter it, they shape it. As tectonic forces reshape continents, mountain ranges rise in places where plates collide or where crust thickens during breakup. These ranges alter climate, redirect rivers, and create ecological divides. A mountain range does not need to be impassable to function as a border. It only needs to be inconvenient enough to reduce contact. Fewer crossings mean fewer interactions. Over time, that reduction compounds, language diverges, practices shift. What was once a shared system becomes regionalized. Unlike political borders, mountains do not negotiate. They do not move to accommodate trade or alliance. They persist long enough to reshape entire evolutionary and cultural trajectories. Species on one side adapt to different conditions than those on the other. Human groups do the same. Knowledge that depends on frequent exchange loses coherence. The combined effect of oceans and mountains is fragmentation with finality. Routes do not just become longer, they disappear. Memory tied to those routes loses relevance. Stories of distant places become abstract. Eventually they fade. This process is slow enough that it feels natural to those living through it. No one declares that the world has become disconnected. People simply stop travelling as far. They stop expecting visitors from certain directions. Horizons shrink. From within a society, this contraction may even feel stabilising. Fewer external influences mean fewer disruptions. Local traditions solidify. Identity becomes more clearly defined, but the cost is invisibly high. Loss of redundancy, loss of shared problem solving, loss of access to ideas developed elsewhere. Civilization at scale depends on circulation. Circulation of goods, of people, of knowledge. When oceans erase roads, circulation becomes selective. When mountains become borders, circulation becomes conditional. Over time, scale collapses. What had once been a planet-wide system, if it existed at all, would now function only in fragments. Each fragment might still be intelligent, adaptive, and culturally rich, but none would retain awareness of the larger structure that once connected them. From the geological record, this transition leaves clear markers. Ocean basins open, continental margins form, mountain belts rise. These are dramatic signatures studied in detail. What they do not record is the loss of connection. They do not capture the moment when a journey stopped being attempted, or when a shared tradition ceased to be reinforced. Those losses happen in the realm of behaviour, not rock. They leave no layer, no fossil, no anomaly easily distinguished from natural variation. Yet their impact on any civilization would be profound. As oceans expand, time itself changes character. Communication delays stretch beyond usefulness. Planning horizons shorten. Coordination across distance becomes impractical. Large-scale projects lose feasibility. Local concerns dominate. Mountains reinforce this inward turn. Valleys become worlds unto themselves. High passes become points of control or avoidance. Even when crossings exist, they funnel interaction through narrow channels, amplifying the effects of disruption when those channels fail. Eventually the planet reaches a new equilibrium. Continents are separate. Oceans are wide. Mountain ranges stabilize and erode slowly. Life adapts to the new configuration. From that point forward, reconnection is no longer part of the system's dynamics. The separation is complete. Any civilization that arose during the Age of Connection would now exist, if at all, as isolated descendants with no awareness of their shared origin. Their histories would begin locally. Their myths would explain separation without reference to unity. The idea that roads once spanned what is now ocean would sound implausible, even absurd. This is how erasure happens on a planetary scale. Not through destruction, but through replacement. Old pathways are not violently removed. They are gently overwritten by new realities until they no longer make sense. From our vantage point, looking back across deep time, we see continents drifting, oceans forming, mountains rising. We infer the physical processes with confidence. What we cannot see is the social cost of those processes, the quiet dissolution of systems that required a different geography to survive. Understanding this does not require believing that such a civilization existed. It requires recognizing that geography sets limits on what can persist. Intelligence does not float above the planet that supports it. It is anchored to pathways, resources, and contact. When those anchors move or vanish, intelligence must shrink its scope or disappear. As oceans erase roads and mountains harden into borders, the planet makes a choice on behalf of whatever lives upon it. Connection gives way to separation. Scale gives way to locality. Memory gives way to reinvention. Very little of the world we live in now would survive 100 million years, and almost none of it would survive in a form we would recognize. That statement sounds dramatic, but it is simply a description of how the Earth works. The planet is not a storage device. It is a system in constant motion, one that recycles its surface over and over again. When viewed through that lens, the disappearance of evidence stops being mysterious and starts becoming inevitable. To understand why almost nothing would survive for us to find, it helps to first let go of how short human history feels to us. 10,000 years already seems ancient. 100,000 years pushes the limits of familiarity. 1,000,000 years feels almost abstract. Yet Pangaea began to break apart over 200 million years ago. That is not just longer than recorded history, it is longer than the entire existence of our species, by several orders of magnitude. Over such spans, the rules change. The most important rule is that the Earth actively destroys its own surface. Continental crust is not immortal. It cracks, bends, erodes, subducts, melts, and reforms. Oceanic crust is even more temporary. None of the seafloor we see today is older than about 200 million years, because it is constantly being created at mid-ocean ridges and consumed at subduction zones. Anything that once existed on older ocean floors is simply gone. Even continental surfaces which last longer are not safe. Erosion alone is enough to erase almost any structure given enough time. Wind, water, ice, and chemical weathering grind mountains into sediment. Rivers carry that sediment away, spreading it across floodplains and into oceans. Over millions of years, entire mountain ranges vanish, reduced to flat landscapes that later rise again in different forms. A city built of stone might survive a few thousand years if abandoned. Given tens of thousands, it would crumble into rubble. Given hundreds of thousands, that rubble would be dispersed. Given millions, it would be buried, altered, or destroyed entirely. Given hundreds of millions, it would not exist in any meaningful sense at all. Its atoms would still be part of the Earth, but rearranged beyond recognition. Burial does not guarantee preservation. Sediments are compacted under pressure, heated and chemically altered. Rocks metamorphose. Original textures disappear. Distinct shapes blur. Even fossils, which feel like miracles when they are found, represent an extraordinarily small fraction of what once lived. The conditions required for fossilization are narrow, and even fossils that do form are often destroyed later by tectonic processes. Now consider materials commonly associated with civilization. Wood rots, fibers decay, leather, hide, and plant-based materials vanish quickly unless preserved in exceptional conditions. Metals corrode. Even relatively stable metals like copper oxidize and disperse. Iron rusts aggressively. Over deep time, metal artifacts break down into minerals indistinguishable from naturally occurring ones. Stone tools fare better, but only marginally. Stone survives, but context does not. A shaped tool is meaningful only if it can be distinguished from naturally fractured rock. Over millions of years, edges wear down. Surfaces are abraded. Pieces are transported, mixed, broken, and redeposited. Without context, intention becomes impossible to prove. Even if an artifact survived physically, recognizing it would be another challenge entirely. Archaeology relies on patterns, repeated shapes, associated materials, stratigraphic context. In deep time, those patterns are scrambled. Layers are folded, overturned, eroded, and reassembled. What was once a clear sequence becomes a geological puzzle with most of the pieces missing. Fire, often cited as a key indicator of intelligence, also fails to leave clear long-term traces. Charcoal can persist, but it is common in the geological record due to natural wildfires. Differentiating intentional fire use from natural burning requires patterns that are consistent and contextual. Over hundreds of millions of years, those patterns dissolve into background noise. Agriculture, if it existed, would leave subtle ecological signatures rather than obvious ruins. Changes in pollen distribution, altered species composition, modified soils. Yet all of these can also result from natural climate change, tectonic uplift, or volcanic activity. Separating intentional influence from natural processes becomes increasingly speculative as time stretches. Large-scale environmental modification, like deforestation or irrigation, would likewise blur. Forests regrow, Rivers change course, sediments redistribute. What looks like deliberate alteration on short timescales becomes indistinguishable from natural landscape evolution on long ones. Even something as striking as mining would not guarantee recognition. Mines collapse. Tunnels fill with sediment. Excavated material erodes and spreads. Chemical signatures disperse. Given enough time, a mine becomes just another irregularity in the rock record, easily attributed to natural variation. One might imagine that intelligence would leave behind something unmistakable, something too precise or too complex to be natural. But nature produces extraordinary complexity on its own. Crystals form perfect geometries. Biological processes create intricate structures. Geological formations can appear artificial at first glance. The standard for proving intentionality becomes extremely high, and rightly so. Another important factor is scale. A civilization that existed before the breakup of Pangaea would not necessarily cover the entire supercontinent uniformly. Even human civilization today, with billions of people, occupies only a fraction of the planet intensively. Vast regions remain lightly touched. An earlier civilization, especially one adapted to stability and balance rather than expansion, might leave an even smaller footprint. That footprint would then be subjected to the most violent reshaping the planet has to offer. Continental breakup is not gentle over deep time. It involves massive volcanism, faulting, uplift and subsidence. Regions are stretched thin, flooded or buried under kilometers of lava flows. The Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, associated with Pangea's breakup, covered millions of square kilometers with basalt. Anything on the surface beneath those flows would be obliterated. Subduction zones add another layer of erasure. Entire sections of continental margin are dragged into the mantle, where heat and pressure destroy all surface features. No artifact, no structure, no fossil survives that journey. It is not buried. It is unmade. Even areas that avoid subduction are not safe. Isostatic rebound lifts regions that were once buried, exposing them to erosion. Others sink and accumulate sediment, compressing and altering whatever lies beneath. Over time, the surface we see becomes a patchwork, assembled from fragments of different ages, with enormous gaps between them. This means that preservation is not just unlikely. It is selective in ways that bias what we can ever know. What survives tends to be simple, hard, and chemically stable. Complex systems, social structures and behaviours leave almost nothing behind. This is why the fossil record contains abundant shells and bones, but almost no trace of soft-bodied organisms. It is why entire ecosystems can vanish without clear explanation. It is why even recent geological events can be difficult to reconstruct with confidence. Human intuition struggles with this because we live on a planet that feels solid and reliable. We build on bedrock and expect it to stay where it is. But the bedrock itself is temporary. It just moves on a timescale that feels slow to us. When imagining a lost civilization, people often ask why we have not found its ruins. The more appropriate question is why we would expect to. The conditions required to preserve recognizable ruins for hundreds of millions of years are so specific and so rare that expecting them becomes unreasonable, even if such a civilization left behind something truly distinctive. The odds that it would survive every destructive process, remain accessible, and be correctly interpreted by a later species are vanishingly small. Each requirement multiplies the improbability. Interpretation is especially important. Finding something unusual is not the same as recognizing it as evidence of intelligence. Geology is full of oddities. Without clear context, unusual formations are explained through natural processes, because natural processes are known to produce extraordinary variety. Science is cautious by necessity. It demands evidence that can withstand scrutiny. In deep time, evidence degrades faster than standards relax. This creates a gap between what might have existed and what can be demonstrated. This gap does not mean anything can be claimed without restraint. It means that certainty has limits. The absence of evidence for ancient intelligence is expected under the conditions the Earth imposes. It does not strongly argue for or against the idea on its own. What remains instead of artifacts or indirect constraints, what the Earth can preserve, what it reliably erases, what patterns we can and cannot expect to see after immense spans of time. These constraints shape how we interpret silence. Almost nothing surviving is not a failure of discovery. It is a feature of planetary dynamics. The Earth is not trying to hide its past. It is simply indifferent to preserving it. Understanding this shifts the conversation. The question becomes not, where are the ruins, but what kind of traces could possibly endure? The answer is sobering. Very few. And those that do would be ambiguous at best. As continents drifted apart, as oceans widened and mountains rose, the planet systematically dismantled the physical context in which any early civilization might have existed. Roads were flooded, settlements were buried or eroded, regions were subducted or resurfaced. Over time, even the memory of those places, if it survived biologically, would lose any anchor in the physical world. From our position now, looking back, we see a planet that appears empty of such stories. But emptiness in the record does not mean emptiness in reality. It means the medium could not hold the message. This realization is not meant to suggest that we are missing something obvious, or that certainty is impossible in all cases. It is meant to align expectation with process. Deep time is not compatible with preservation of complexity. Across cultures that never met and landscapes that were never connected within recorded history, certain stories keep appearing. They do not arrive with the same names or details, and they are not told in the same voices, yet they circle around familiar themes. A world that was once whole, a great separation, land swallowed by water, paths that vanished, ancestors who came from somewhere no longer reachable. These stories are usually grouped together under the label of myth, a word that often implies fiction, imagination, or symbolic truth rather than historical reality. But myth is not simply invention. It is memory that has lost its original frame of reference. When physical evidence disappears, memory does not vanish instantly. It changes form. Knowledge that can no longer be verified against the landscape stops being technical and becomes narrative. Practical instructions turn into stories. Observations become symbols. Over long spans of time, meaning survives even when mechanism is forgotten. This is how echoes form, not as records of specific events, but as impressions carried forward through generations. Deep time stretches those echoes thin. With each retelling, details are simplified, localized, adapted to new environments. A story that once described a slow encroachment of the sea over lowlands becomes, generations later, a sudden flood sent by gods or fate. A memory of roots disappearing underwater transforms into tales of lost lands, sunken worlds, or unreachable homelands. The truth is not preserved in accuracy, but in persistence. It is tempting to dismiss such stories as coincidence or as reflections of common human psychology. Water is frightening. Separation is painful. Loss invites explanation. All of this is true, yet the sheer consistency of certain motifs appearing independently across distant cultures suggests that something deeper is at work. Not a single event remembered perfectly, but a shared pattern of experience repeated across different regions as the planet itself changed. If a civilization existed during the breakup of Pangaea, its experience of separation would not be a single catastrophe. It would be an ongoing process, unfolding over thousands of generations. No one would remember the beginning. No one would live to see the end. Instead, memory would track fragments. The land used to extend farther. The journey used to be shorter. The crossing used to be possible. These kinds of memories do not lend themselves to precise storytelling. They are not battles or rulers or inventions. They are absences, gradual losses, changes noticed only in retrospect. Myth is well suited to this kind of memory because it does not require exactness. It preserves emotional truth rather than factual detail. Consider how often myths describe a time when humans lived closer to the world, when animals spoke, when boundaries were fluid. These are not scientific claims, they are reflections of a remembered difference between then and now. A sense that the present world is more fragmented, more constrained, more distant from an earlier state of connection. From a geological perspective, this matches reality. The Earth has become more fragmented over time. Continents have separated, oceans have widened, isolation has increased. From the perspective of life, especially intelligent life dependent on movement and exchange, the world has grown more divided. As deep time advances, the cause of that division becomes invisible. The mechanisms of plate tectonics are not obvious without instruments and theory. What remains is the experience of loss. Myth gives that loss shape. Echoes also persist in cultural practices. Certain rituals oriented around cardinal directions, horizons, or vanished landscapes may once have had practical significance. When the environment changes, those practices lose their original function, but may persist symbolically. Over time, their purpose becomes obscure, yet they are still performed because they feel necessary, meaningful, or inherited. Language itself carries shadows of earlier worlds. Words for places that no longer exist, terms that imply journeys no longer possible, metaphors rooted in landscapes that are absent from the speaker's environment. Linguists sometimes identify these as anomalies, but over deep time, even anomalies are smoothed out or reinterpreted. Memory under these conditions does not behave like a record, it behaves like sediment. Layers build up. Older meanings are buried beneath newer interpretations. Pressure reshapes what remains. What surfaces later is altered, compressed, and incomplete. This is why myths cannot be read literally when searching for deep history. They are not archives. They are fossils of experience. Like biological fossils, they preserve shape without preserving function. They show that something existed, not exactly what it was. The long shadow of deep time ensures that even these echoes fade eventually. As continents drift farther apart and new civilizations arise independently, shared mythic structures diverge. Stories adapt to local conditions. Flood myths appear in river cultures. Lost land stories emerge in coastal societies. Separation is explained through different metaphors depending on environment. Yet even in this divergence, a common thread remains. The sense that the world was once different, that something was lost, that the present is not the beginning, but a continuation shaped by forces no longer visible. This sense does not require an ancient global civilization to exist. It arises naturally from living on a dynamic planet. However, if such a civilization did exist, its disappearance would amplify this effect. Knowledge of a connected world would fragment into regional memories. Each fragment would reinterpret loss through its own lens. Importantly, myth does not preserve hierarchy or technology well. It preserves relationships. Who belonged to whom? What was shared? What was taken away? This makes it particularly suited to remembering separation rather than construction. Modern humans often underestimate how long oral memory can persist. In some cases, indigenous oral traditions have been shown to preserve references to real geological events, such as volcanic eruptions or sea level rise, across thousands of years. Not with precision, but with enough consistency to be recognizable when compared with physical evidence. Scale this persistence up across much longer times, and the memory becomes less precise, but not necessarily meaningless. It becomes archetypal rather than historical, a flood instead of a shoreline retreat, a great divide instead of a widening rift, a lost homeland instead of a receding continent. Skepticism is appropriate here. Not every myth encodes ancient truth. Human imagination is powerful, and narrative patterns recur for many reasons. But dismissing myth entirely as irrelevant to deep history ignores how humans transmit understanding in the absence of written records. If intelligence existed before the breakup of Pangaea and then fragmented, myth would be one of the few carriers capable of bridging such loss, even imperfectly. It would not tell us what happened in detail, it would tell us how it felt. The long shadow of deep time ensures that by the time later civilizations arise, these echoes are no longer recognizable as memory. They feel timeless, universal, detached from any specific past. That timelessness is misleading. It is the result of extreme age, not eternal origin. From our perspective now, myths appear alongside a geological record that is largely silent about intelligence before humans. The silence and the stories seem disconnected, but silence is expected, and stories are resilient. They occupy different registers of memory. None of this proves that a first civilization existed. Proof requires evidence, and deep time erases most evidence. What this perspective offers instead is coherence. It explains why the idea of a lost past feels compelling across cultures, even when physical confirmation is absent. It explains why the Earth feels older than our histories, heavier with experience than our records can account for. As the planet continued to reshape itself, the echoes of earlier connections would fade further. New civilizations would arise on separate continents, each believing itself unique, each constructing its own origin stories, unaware that the sense of loss embedded in those stories might not be purely symbolic. Deep time casts long shadows, not because it hides secrets deliberately, but because it stretches memory beyond its limits. What remains are outlines, impressions, a feeling that something once connected the world more closely than it does now. It is an uncomfortable thought, not because it is frightening, but because it unsettles something we rarely question. The idea that humanity might not be the first intelligence to organize itself at scale on this planet challenges the quiet assumption that our story begins at the beginning. We tend to see ourselves as pioneers standing at the edge of a blank past, with nothing behind us but simple life slowly crawling forward until it finally reached us. Yet the Earth's history does not resemble a straight path. It looks more like a series of experiments, most of them ending quietly, without ceremony, and without leaving instructions for what comes next. If humanity is a second attempt, or a later attempt, then we did not inherit a pristine world. We arrived on a planet already shaped by processes far older than our species, processes that had already tested complexity, connection, and collapse in ways we cannot fully reconstruct. By the time humans began spreading across the continents, the Earth had already broken itself apart, stitched itself back together in different forms, and erased most traces of what came before. Whatever intelligence may have existed earlier, if any, would not have left as a warning or a guide. We would be learning everything again from scratch, without knowing it. This lack of awareness is not a failure of perception. It is a consequence of scale. Humans evolved in a world where the continents were already separate, where oceans felt eternal, where mountains appeared fixed, and where the ground beneath our feet seemed stable enough to build on indefinitely. Our sense of permanence is shaped by the stability of the Holocene, a brief window of relative calm in an otherwise restless planetary history. Within that window, agriculture became viable, settlements expanded, writing emerged, memory externalized itself into objects. Civilization, as we recognize it, took shape. From within this experience, it feels natural to assume that no one else reached this point before us. We look backward and see no cities older than a certain age, no machines buried in ancient rock, no inscriptions predating known history. But this expectation rests on a misunderstanding of what deep time does to evidence. It assumes that success must announce itself loudly and permanently. It assumes that intelligence inevitably leads to domination of the landscape in ways that cannot be erased. Yet our own civilization, if stripped of its ongoing maintenance, would not survive long in recognizable form. Cities collapse within centuries, infrastructure decays within decades. Left alone, even our most impressive constructions would be swallowed by vegetation, eroded by weather, and eventually reduced to sediment. Extend that process across tens or hundreds of millions of years, and almost nothing remains that could be confidently identified as intentional. If an earlier civilization existed, its disappearance would not require a dramatic ending. It would not need to be wiped out by an asteroid or global fire. It could simply be overtaken by the same forces that now challenge us: climate change, geographic fragmentation, loss of connectivity, environmental shifts that outpace adaptation. In that sense, the Earth does not need to be hostile to intelligence. It only needs to remain indifferent. Humanity's rise, then, would not represent the culmination of a linear progression, but the reopening of a possibility. Intelligence emerges when conditions allow it. It organizes itself when stability permits. It expands when connectivity supports it. And it fragments when those supports fail. None of this requires intent or destiny. It is a pattern that can repeat. What makes the idea of a second attempt unsettling is not the possibility of predecessors, but the implication that success is temporary by default. If someone came before us and vanished without trace, then permanence is not guaranteed by intelligence alone. It depends on how intelligence interacts with the planet that hosts it. Humans often speak of mastering nature, but in reality, we operate within narrow margins defined by climate, geography, and energy availability. Our technologies amplify our reach, but they also bind us more tightly to complex systems that require constant coordination. The more interconnected we become, the more vulnerable we are to disruption. This is not unique to us. Any civilization that grows beyond local scale faces the same trade-off. If a previous intelligence learned this lesson and chose restraint over expansion, it might leave even fewer traces. A civilization that avoids large-scale extraction, monumental construction, and irreversible landscape modification would be nearly invisible in the deep past. Its success would be measured in longevity rather than imprint. From our perspective, such success would look like absence. Alternatively, a civilization might expand, fragment, and simplify over time as the planet reshaped itself. By the time humans arrived, only scattered descendants might remain, biologically or behaviorally altered beyond recognition. Intelligence could recede rather than vanish outright, returning to forms that leave little trace. This raises a difficult question about our own position. Are we aware of the conditions that support our civilization, or do we mistake them for constants? Oceans feel permanent, continents feel stable, climate feels predictable. Yet all of these are temporary states in a much longer cycle. The same processes that broke Pangaea apart are still operating today, just at speeds that fall below our daily perception. Humanity's global civilization depends on connectivity, trade routes, communication networks, shared standards, collective knowledge. These are our equivalents of the land bridges and routes that once connected a unified world. We assume they will persist, because they have persisted throughout our recorded history. But recorded history is short. If connectivity breaks, not abruptly but gradually, through climate stress, resource depletion, or geopolitical fragmentation, our systems could simplify without a clear moment of collapse. Knowledge would localize, technology would diverge, global coordination would weaken, intelligence would persist, but at reduced scale. Seen this way, humanity does not stand apart from hypothetical predecessors. We follow the same constraints. We are not special because we are intelligent. We are subject to the same planetary processes that would have shaped any earlier attempt. The most striking similarity would be unawareness. If an earlier civilization existed, it likely did not know it was early. It would not see itself as a trial run. It would experience its world as complete, stable enough, and open-ended. Only in retrospect would its place in deep time become apparent, and retrospection requires survivors. Humanity, too, does not experience itself as temporary. We plan in decades, sometimes centuries, rarely longer. Our institutions struggle to account for timescales beyond immediate relevance, yet the Earth operates on timescales that render our longest plans brief. The absence of inherited knowledge from a previous civilization would not be surprising. Even if such knowledge existed, it would require continuity to survive. Writing alone is insufficient without readers. Monuments alone are meaningless without context. Technologies alone decay without maintenance. Memory requires an unbroken chain of transmission, and continental drift is exceptionally good at breaking chains. If humanity is unaware of the first attempt, it is because awareness itself could not survive the transition. The planet did not preserve it, not out of malice, but because preservation is not its function. This does not mean that humanity is doomed to repeat the same outcome. Repetition does not imply inevitability. It implies constraint. Understanding those constraints is the only way to respond differently. Whether we can or will is an open question. Thinking of humanity as a second attempt reframes progress. Instead of seeing ourselves at the top of a ladder, we might see ourselves on a platform temporarily supported by conditions we did not create and cannot control indefinitely. This perspective does not diminish our achievements, it contextualizes them. It also changes how we interpret silence. The lack of evidence for prior intelligence stops being proof of uniqueness and becomes a reminder of how thoroughly the Earth edits its past. Silence is not emptiness, it is compression. If intelligence has arisen more than once, then the Earth is not waiting for a single perfect outcome. It is exploring possibilities. Some last longer than others. None are guaranteed permanence. Humanity's challenge, then, is not to assume primacy, but to recognize fragility, to understand that civilization is not an endpoint, but a phase that depends on geography, climate, energy, and connection remaining within certain bounds. Reshaping the planet faster than any natural process has in millions of years, we may be testing those bounds again. Whether this leads to persistence, fragmentation, or disappearance is not written yet. What is clear is that awareness alone does not protect against the forces that shape deep time. If we are a second attempt, unaware of the first, then the most important question is not who came before us, but what conditions allowed us to arise at all. Because those conditions are changing, and they will continue to change long after any single generation is gone. Beneath every landscape we recognize, there is another one folded away, compressed, altered, and largely inaccessible, yet not entirely gone. The Earth does not remember in the way minds do. It does not recall events, tell stories, or preserve meaning. What it does instead is record pressure, chemistry, movement, and time. Even when almost everything is erased, something is always carried forward, not as narrative, but as consequence. If the first civilization disappeared when Pangaea split, and if humanity arrived much later without awareness of that earlier attempt, then the only witness that spanned both moments is the planet itself. Not as a conscious observer, but as a medium through which cause and effect propagate endlessly. The Earth might not remember who lived, but it remembers that something lived. It remembers disturbance, adaptation, imbalance, and recovery. Those memories are subtle, encoded in places we rarely think to look. Consider how the Earth responds to life in general. Living systems do not simply occupy space, they alter it. They change atmospheric composition, soil structure, erosion rates, and biological relationships. Over long periods, these changes accumulate into planetary signatures. Oxygen in the atmosphere is one such memory, a lasting consequence of ancient biological activity that transformed the planet irrevocably. No organism intended to create an oxygen-rich atmosphere, yet the Earth still carries that imprint billions of years later. If an early intelligent civilization existed, its presence would not be remembered as cities or machines, but as shifts layered atop natural processes, slight accelerations in erosion where landscapes were managed, subtle redistribution of species where movement was intentional rather than accidental, changes in fire regimes where burning was controlled rather than purely natural. None of these would announce intelligence directly, but together they could nudge planetary systems in detectable ways. The difficulty is that the Earth does not label its memories. It does not distinguish between intentional and unintentional change. A forest burned by lightning and a forest burned deliberately may look identical in the geological record after enough time has passed. A species moved by climate drift and one moved by intelligent agency leave similar traces once the context is gone. Meaning dissolves faster than effect. What the Earth retains most reliably are patterns of imbalance and recovery, periods where systems were pushed beyond their usual bounds, followed by reorganization. Life has caused this many times without intelligence. Algal blooms changed oceans, plants reshaped continents by stabilizing soils, animals altered ecosystems through grazing and predation. Intelligence would not introduce a fundamentally new category of change. It would amplify existing ones. This is why searching for memory in the Earth is not about finding anomalies that scream intention. It is about noticing cumulative effects that seem slightly out of proportion to known drivers, yet still explainable without invoking anything extraordinary. The planet remembers by exaggeration, not by inscription. There is also memory in absence. When something disappears completely, it leaves behind a vacancy that other processes fill. Extinctions create openings. Fragmentation reshapes evolutionary paths. A civilization that vanished during continental breakup would leave behind ecological and cultural voids that subsequent life would inhabit, without awareness of what came before. The Earth would remember not the thing itself, but the reshaping caused by its removal. This kind of memory is frustratingly indirect. It does not allow for clear reconstruction. It allows only inference. Scientists already work this way when reconstructing ancient climates or ecosystems. They piece together temperature from isotopes, rainfall from sediment grain size, vegetation from pollen. Each line of evidence is partial. Together they form a picture that is always provisional. If intelligence once influenced those systems, its signal would be diluted among many others. Distinguishing it would require not certainty but plausibility. And plausibility alone is rarely enough to satisfy scientific standards, especially when alternative explanations exist. Yet the Earth's memory is not static. It continues to evolve as we interact with it. Humanity is now leaving marks that will persist for millions of years. Not our names or stories, but our consequences. Altered carbon cycles, rapid species redistribution, novel materials embedded in sediments. These are the kinds of memories the planet keeps. Ironically, this means we understand better than ever how an earlier civilization could vanish without trace. We can see how quickly meaning disappears even while effect remains. A future intelligence, looking back at our era through rock layers, might detect a brief disruption, a spike, a reorganization. Whether it would interpret that as intelligence is uncertain. What the Earth might still remember, even if we don't, is not a narrative of rise and fall, but a rhythm. Periods of increasing complexity followed by fragmentation, expansion followed by constraint, connection followed by isolation. These rhythms recur because they are driven by planetary dynamics, not by the intentions of those living on the surface. Continental drift enforces separation, climate oscillations enforce adaptation, resource distribution enforces movement. These forces shape life regardless of intelligence. Intelligence does not escape them. It only responds within them. From this perspective, humanity is not unique in facing a forgetting planet. We are simply conscious of it in ways earlier intelligences may not have been. That awareness does not grant immunity. It grants responsibility and perhaps humility. The Earth will continue to remember in its own way long after our records are gone, long after languages vanish, long after cities erode. It will carry forward the consequences of what lived here, smoothing them, blending them, integrating them into whatever comes next. There is a quiet comfort in this, not because it promises preservation, but because it places us within a continuity that does not depend on being remembered. Life participates. It alters the system. The system responds. Nothing is truly wasted, even when nothing is retained in recognizable form. If there was a first civilization, its greatest legacy would not be a ruin waiting to be found. It would be the fact that the planet was capable of supporting such complexity at all. That possibility, once realized, does not vanish. It reappears when conditions allow. Humanity's existence is evidence of that capacity, regardless of what came before. We are not proof of uniqueness. We are proof of recurrence. The Earth remembers recurrence. It remembers that complexity can arise, that connection can form, that fragmentation can undo it, and that, given time, the cycle can begin again. When we imagine the deep past, it is tempting to seek closure, to want a definitive answer about whether anyone came before us. But deep time does not offer closure. It offers continuity without narrative, memory without meaning, record without interpretation. What the Earth might still remember is not a story we can read. It is a pattern we are living inside of. Whether we recognize it or not, we are part of the same long experiment, shaped by the same forces, moving toward outcomes we cannot fully predict. The planet will not judge this attempt against the last. It will not compare successes or failures. It will simply continue, carrying forward whatever effects remain, discarding whatever cannot persist. In that sense, the Earth does not forget us. It transforms us, and long after our own memories fade, something of what we did, how we lived, and how we interacted with this moving world will remain embedded in the slow, patient processes that outlast all stories. Not as evidence waiting to be found, but as consequence already unfolding, folded into the future of a planet that has always been less concerned with who remembers than with what continues.